Imagine waking to darkness that never ends. No sunrise creeping across the horizon. No clock to tell you how long it has been since the last flicker of light. Only the whisper of wind, the creak of frozen trees, and the faint sound of your own breath clouding in the air. That was life for our ancestors. During the deepest winters of prehistory, a world where night could stretch for weeks, even months, and the sun's return was never certain. They didn't call it winter. To them, it was something alive, a presence that crept slowly, swallowing sound, light, and colour. Across vast plains of ice and endless forests, small groups of humans huddled together, surrounded by silence so complete it could drive a person to tears. The cold wasn't just a temperature, it was a weight pressing down on every living thing. Even the animals moved differently, slower, cautious, as if the air itself resisted motion. The people who lived through it understood that the world could disappear. One day, the sky dimmed. The next, the rivers froze solid. Food vanished beneath snow. The world became still, as though it had exhaled for the last time. For them, time didn't move forward, it drifted sideways. They counted days not by light, but by the fading of warmth in their bones. Somewhere in a cave at the edge of a frozen valley, a small fire flickered. Its glow danced across rough walls, casting the shadows of people who knew they were small beneath the endless night. Around that fire, myths were born not of gods of abundance or love, but of endurance and fear. In the darkness, stories became light. They told of spirits who devoured the sun, of celestial hunters chasing it through the underworld, and of ancient bargains that would one day bring dawn back to the world. Across the continents, far from each other, tribes created eerily similar tales. In the Arctic, they spoke of a giant who swallowed daylight whole. In the steppes of Central Asia, the sun was said to sink into a sea of ice, fighting its way back through the months of shadow. In old Europe, early people watched the sun's path shrink lower and lower until it seemed ready to vanish forever. To them, this was not a season, it was a test. The cold tested everything: the strength of shelters, the stores of food, the trust between neighbours. But it also tested belief. When you live in endless dark, you start to wonder if light is something the world owes you, or something you must earn. Every creak in the frozen forest, every howl of a wolf far beyond the firelight, became a reminder that the world was alive, indifferent, and immense. The ancient winter was a mirror. It reflected human fragility back at them, yet it also revealed their quiet power. They learned that hope was not warmth, not food, not even shelter. Hope was memory. The memory that somewhere, beyond the horizon, the sun still existed. It had disappeared before, and it had returned. That knowledge became their inheritance, passed down through whispered stories told under firs, in the breath before sleep. The stillness was deceptive. Beneath the snow, the earth slept, but not forever. The people believed they could feel its heartbeat, faint but steady, echoing through the frozen ground. Some claimed to dream of it, a pulse deep below their feet, promising renewal. Others dreamed of ancestors walking across frozen rivers, carrying light in their hands. These weren't fantasies. They were survival mechanisms, the human mind's way of fighting despair. Every ancient winter was a confrontation with the unknown. The sky dimmed earlier each day, and even the stars seemed more distant. Without the sun, direction itself was lost. Hunters who once roamed familiar paths could vanish into the blinding white, never to return. Villages shrank inward, their worlds reduced to a circle of light no wider than their hearth. And yet, despite the darkness, they endured not just through strength, but through ritual. At the heart of every fire was an understanding that survival depended on believing the night would end. They didn't know the science of the Earth's tilt or the orbit of the sun, but they knew pattern. They observed. They felt. And they passed that knowing on through song, through symbol, through the quiet rhythm of stories repeated like prayers. So when the long dark came again, and it always did, they were ready in spirit, if not in comfort. They faced it not as victims, but as witnesses. Because somewhere inside them was the unshakable conviction that the sun had not died, only hidden, and one day it would rise again. And when it did, it would find them still here, smaller than the stars, but undefeated. Before there were calendars or clocks, there was only the sky. It was the first book humanity ever learned to read, vast, shifting, and full of signs. Long before winter arrived, people began watching for its approach, tracing the slow retreat of the sun like witnesses to a vanishing miracle. They didn't see astronomy, they saw prophecy. Each shortening day was a message written in light. Imagine standing on an open plain thousands of years ago, the wind cold enough to sting your eyes. Above you, the sun hangs lower than it did last season, taking longer to rise, quicker to fade. You notice the pattern, not with instruments or numbers, but with memory, the shadows growing longer, the warmth slipping away faster. The realization settles slowly. The sun is leaving, and no one knows if it plans to return. Across the world, different tribes began to mark that fading light. Stones were placed, aligned perfectly with the sun's arc. Wooden poles, mounds, and standing circles appeared across landscapes the earliest calendars. They were not made to measure time, but to reassure the human spirit that time still existed. At the moment when the sun reached its lowest, when the day was at its shortest, they gathered in silence and waited. They didn't understand the celestial mechanics, but they felt the weight of the cycle life folding into darkness, then opening again. At Stonehenge, shadows crawled across monoliths like ancient clock hands. In the frozen steppes of Siberia, shamans painted spirals on cave walls, symbols of the sun's path through the underworld. Far away in Central Asia, nomadic clans built temporary shrines on windswept ridges, believing the sun could hear them better from high ground. In every culture, across thousands of miles, the message was the same. We see you, even when you're gone. It wasn't superstition, it was survival through understanding. The people learned to anticipate change not through luck, but through observation. They knew the first signs of the long dark, birds vanishing south, herds moving slower, the silence of frogs and crickets. Even the colour of twilight changed, deepening into a blue so heavy it felt eternal. And yet, within that dread, there was wonder. The stars, once background light, became companions. They grew brighter, sharper, as if leaning closer to witness humanity's fragile endurance. When the first star refused to rise, they said the world was about to sleep. That idea travelled through generations. Some cultures believed the heavens themselves were alive, that constellations breathed and shifted as omens. To lose the sun, even briefly, was to lose the heartbeat of the world. So they created stories to make sense of it. Cosmic hunts, divine sacrifices, lovers parted and reunited in endless cycles. Each myth was a mirror of the same question. Will light return? The ancients became patient scientists without realizing it. They tracked the sun's return over centuries, marking the solstice as proof of life's persistence. In that moment, hope became measurable. When the dawn lingered a little longer, they celebrated not with fireworks or speeches, but with fire, dance, and breath. Rituals formed to hold the darkness at bay. In those gatherings, people weren't just predicting the future, they were participating in it. The act of reading the sky shaped the way humanity thought. It created the first sense of control over chaos. Watching the heavens was not about curiosity, it was about trust. The same stars that hung over their ancestors would hang over their children. Even when entire generations passed between warm years, the rhythm remained. The sky, distant and vast, became the first constant in a world that offered few. And so, they learned to prepare their minds before they prepared their shelters. The solstice wasn't only an astronomical event, it was psychological. It gave them a reason to endure. As the horizon dimmed earlier each day, people told one another that the light would soon turn again, that the longest night would give way to dawn. Hope became ritual, ritual became rhythm, and rhythm became survival. If you stood among them shivering, watching the same fading light they did, you might feel something strange. Peace. Because beneath the fear, there was a pattern. The world wasn't ending, it was breathing. In and out, life and death, darkness and dawn. They were not separate states, but two sides of the same pulse. Through millennia, these sky watchers left behind their alignments, their carvings, their circles of stone. But what they truly passed down was something quieter, the instinct to look up when afraid. Even today, when the night feels too long or the cold too deep, we still tilt our heads toward the stars, searching for meaning in their ancient geometry. They were never just telling time. They were reminding themselves that the universe, however vast and indifferent, was still repeating its promises. The sun would disappear, yes, but not forever. And as the people prepared to face that truth once again, they began to build, to store, to fortify their fragile warmth. Because understanding the sky was only the beginning. The real test would come when the cold began to speak. The warning signs were never ignored. Long before the first snow fell, people began to move with quiet urgency. The animals knew before the humans did. Birds vanished in swarms, their cries thinning in the empty sky. Rivers slowed, their surfaces thickening with ice that crept from the banks inward. The air grew heavy, sharper, and the sun's warmth became a faint memory. That was when the ancient world began its ritual of preparation, not for comfort, but for survival. Villages turned inward. Hunters became gatherers, builders, and craftsmen. The work began early, before the land froze completely. Fires burned day and night as meat was smoked and dried, the smell drifting through camps like a promise. Women and elders wove furs into layers so dense they could trap body heat for months. Children carried bundles of reeds and bark for insulation, learning that survival was not a task but a shared act of faith. Every movement had weight. Every hour mattered. There was no room for waste. They stored what the earth gave them: roots, nuts, berries hardened by frost. Every scrap of fat was saved, rendered into oil for lamps or used to seal containers. The people knew that in the coming months, warmth itself would become a form of currency. Some used bones to fashion needles, sinew to stitch hides together, transforming necessity into invention. It was an art of endurance, born from repetition, memory, and the soft hum of fear. And beneath it all, the same thought whispered through every settlement. Had they done enough? That question haunted every night as the horizon disappeared earlier and earlier. When the winds began to howl through the cracks of their shelters, they listened, not with panic, but with a quiet, collective understanding. The cold was coming for everyone, and no one could escape it. The shelters themselves were miracles of adaptation. Caves were sealed with stone and moss. Animal bones formed the frames of tents covered in hides. In some regions, families built into the earth, using soil as insulation and snow as a shield. The fire was kept at the center, tended constantly, never allowed to die. The hearth became sacred, a living thing that demanded care and respect. To lose it was to lose hope itself. But even as they prepared, they knew they could never truly master winter. It was a teacher that never spoke softly. Some years, the preparations were enough. Other years, entire groups vanished, swallowed by storms that erased even their footprints. Those who survived passed down their stories not as warnings, but as lessons. They told of the importance of sharing warmth, of rationing even when hunger whispered louder than reason. They taught that the line between life and death was drawn not by strength, but by cooperation. Fear shaped discipline. They learned to listen to silence, the stillness before a blizzard, the change in the air when snow was about to fall. They learned to read the color of the sky as easily as we read words on a page. And when the first true frost arrived, coating every surface in glassy white, they knew it was time to retreat into their sanctuaries. Yet even as the world outside froze solid, life inside continued. People sang softly while working, their voices weaving through the smoke. They told stories of ancestors who had survived winters worse than this, stories that stretched back further than memory. Every generation added to them, layering myth over history until the two became inseparable. Those stories were insulation too, keeping the mind warm when the body trembled. When the final preparations were complete, the people sat in a kind of stillness that only comes before surrender. The last embers were banked, the doors sealed, the animals gathered close. Outside, the first blizzard began its endless song, a howl that rolled across forests and mountains, shaking the world's edge. Inside, the fire answered with its own soft voice, crackling in rhythm, refusing to be silenced. They didn't think of it as hibernation. To them, it was waiting a long, disciplined patience measured not by time but by endurance. Every heartbeat was an act of defiance, every breath a quiet declaration. We are still here. And as the snow buried the land, erasing color, shape, and sound, something remarkable happened. The people stopped fearing the dark. They accepted it, learned from it, and became part of its rhythm. Winter was no longer an enemy, it was a mirror, reflecting back the raw truth of what it meant to be human. The freeze had come, and they were ready for now. The first frost never arrived suddenly. It crept in quietly, like a visitor testing the edge of the world. One morning, the grass was no longer green but silver, each blade wearing a fragile coat of ice that shimmered in the pale light. The people who saw it knew what it meant. The true winter had begun the long descent into stillness. At first, the cold was beautiful. The air was clean and sharp. Rivers froze in elegant patterns that caught the light like veins of glass. The land glittered, transformed into something almost holy. Children marveled at their own breath, turning to mist. Hunters followed animal tracks etched perfectly into the frozen ground, reading them like sacred scripts. But beauty was only the mask winter wore before it revealed its teeth. Soon the ground hardened beyond digging. Streams turned to mirrors, silent and unbroken. The forests that once hummed with life went mute. Even the birds fell quiet, as if the world itself was holding its breath. Inside their shelters, people spoke in lower voices, as though the frost could hear them. It was said that the cold listened, that it carried words through the air and froze them where they stood. In those first days, every small mistake mattered. A dropped ember could mean the death of a fire. An open crack in a wall could let in a whisper of wind that grew into an unbearable chill. People learned to move deliberately, slowly, their actions careful as rituals. The smoke from their fires rose straight and thin, staining the white sky like a signature of life. They adapted to the silence, but the silence changed them. With every passing day, the world outside their dwellings became less familiar. The landmarks disappeared beneath snowdrifts. Paths vanished overnight. The land itself began to erase memory. What was once known became unknowable. Travelers learned to tie ropes between shelters, thin lifelines of fiber that marked the way home through blinding storms. As food grew scarcer, so did sound. The laughter faded first, then the songs. Conversation became practical: who had wood, who had warmth, who had hope. The cold stripped away everything unnecessary, leaving only what mattered most: community, endurance, the steady rhythm of shared breath. It wasn't only the body that was tested. The mind began to play tricks. In the long hours of dark, shadows moved strangely, stretching across walls in shapes that didn't belong to anyone. Some swore they heard voices outside, faint and pleading. Others said they saw figures in the snow, distant and unmoving. The elders called them spirits, the echoes of those who had not survived the winter before. Whether they were real or imagined didn't matter. Fear was as real as frostbite. Yet in that fear, there was a strange intimacy. The people drew closer, not just for warmth, but for reassurance. They listened to each other's breathing, measured time by the rhythm of heartbeats. Every crack of ice on the river outside reminded them how fragile existence could be, and how miraculous it was that they were still here. Sometimes, in the deepest part of night, they would open the door just enough to look out. The world beyond was silent and silver, endless in every direction. The stars hung low and bright, reflecting off the snow until it was impossible to tell where earth ended and sky began. In those moments, time felt suspended. They were no longer people trapped by cold. They were part of something vast, ancient, and watching. When dawn finally arrived, pale and hesitant, it brought no warmth, only light enough to see the frost clinging to every surface like a memory. The people understood now that winter was not an event. It was a presence, a living force that could not be fought, only respected. So they bowed to it in their own way. Every morning, someone fed the fire first thing, a small offering to balance the cold's hunger. They told children that frost was the breath of the earth, that every crystal on a window pane was the mark of a spirit passing by. To survive meant learning to live alongside the unknown. And as the frost deepened, so did their understanding. Survival was not about defeating winter. It was about becoming quiet enough to hear its language. In the heart of every winter shelter, one task mattered above all others: keeping the fire alive. Long before kings or empires, before written words or maps, the firekeeper was the closest thing humanity had to a priest. Their duty was sacred. The flame wasn't just light, it was life itself. Everything depended on it: food, warmth, protection, spirit. To lose it was to invite death. Picture a dark hut pressed into the earth, the ceiling low and smoke curling like ghosts toward the frozen roof. In the center, a slow-burning hearth glows red and steady. A woman tends it with quiet devotion, feeding it splinters of pine and pieces of dried moss. Around her, the others sleep, their faces soft with exhaustion. The air hums faintly with the rhythm of the flame. Outside, the wind screams, clawing at the world. Inside, the fire answers with its calm, patient breath. They learned early that flame has moods. It needed to be watched constantly. Too much air, and it flared. Too little, and it died without sound. Children were taught to blow gently on embers, to coax them like living things. Even the smallest spark was treasured. When families travelled, they carried glowing coals wrapped in moss, nestled inside hollowed horns, so that their ancestors' flame would never fade. In that sense, every generation was borrowing fire from the last, passing down survival as inheritance. Fire became teacher, companion, and god. It cooked their food and kept beasts away, but it also spoke in its own language, the pop, the hiss, the soft collapse of wood into ash. The ancients listened to it the way we listen to the sea. They believed each sound meant something, warning, gratitude, sometimes even laughter. Around that light, stories grew. They said the first fire was stolen from the sky by a daring ancestor who tricked the spirits of frost. Others claimed lightning was a gift, a piece of the heavens meant to remind them that warmth could fall from chaos. In every culture that faced the long dark, fire held its own mythology. Among Arctic tribes, the hearth flame was thought to guide souls safely through the afterlife. In early European villages, a woman's role as keeper of the fire was revered. If her flame burned strong, so would her family. In Central Asia, nomads lit sacred fires before migrations, believing the smoke carried their prayers upward into the domain of forgotten gods. Even when the meanings differed, the reverence was the same. Fire was the breath of the earth, borrowed but never owned. The firekeeper's task was not a constant blaze, but a delicate balance. Too much wood wasted resources, too little risked extinction. They learned to build fires that could sleep banks of ash, hiding a secret glow that could last until morning. Each night, someone stayed awake to tend it, whispering softly as though afraid the flame might feel alone. The firekeeper's hands always smelled of smoke, their eyes rimmed red, but they carried a quiet pride. When others slept through blizzards and howling nights, they sat awake beside the one thing that reminded them the world was still alive. Fire taught patience. It showed that light didn't need to roar, sometimes it only needed to endure. Watching it became a meditation. The slow unravelling of wood into embers, the transformation of matter into warmth. Even now, thousands of years later, people stare into campfires and feel the same pull of primitive peace that defies time. It is the memory of survival coded into our blood. But the flame was more than comfort. It was also a warning. If it flared too high, it could consume what little shelter they had. Entire families learned to fear the sudden shift in smoke, the crackle that meant danger. The same force that preserved life could end it in a breath. And so they treated it like something holy, unpredictable, loved, but never trusted. In the darkest months, fire became ritual. Every new spark struck from flint was greeted with murmured thanks. When a flame was shared between families, it was done with reverence, the passing of a torch symbolizing alliance, forgiveness, or hope. Even wars and rivalries paused for fire. To extinguish someone else's flame was the ultimate curse. And beyond its warmth, fire offered something deeper: companionship. It painted color on faces, made shadows dance like spirits, and filled the endless dark with motion. For those trapped inside during storms, it was the world's last heartbeat. They would sit for hours, saying nothing, just watching the glow. The silence between crackles was not empty, it was alive. It reminded them that despite the cold pressing in, something still burned, stubborn and bright. When morning came, pale, distant, indifferent, the firekeeper would rise before anyone else. They would crouch near the coals, gently stir the ashes, and blow. For a long moment, nothing happened. Then a spark, a breath, a faint flicker, life returning once again. Outside, the frost deepened. The rivers froze, the winds grew harsher, the land seemed to turn to stone. But inside that fragile ring of light, humanity endured. Each flame was a defiance written in gold against the void. And as long as someone kept it alive, the world, too, would keep breathing. When the cold grew too deep for thought, when the wind howled hard enough to drown the world outside, people turned inward, not just into their shelters, but into their minds. Inside those cramped, smoky rooms, they built another kind of fire, the kind that burns in words. Stories became warmth for the soul, and in the long dark, warmth was everything. Imagine a small group gathered near the hearth, their faces flickering in the orange light. The fire's glow does not reach the walls. The darkness beyond it feels endless. A child leans closer, eyes wide, as an elder begins to speak. The words come slowly, soft as embers falling onto ash. It is a story about a hunter who chased the sun when it disappeared, or about a spirit that hides in the snow, whispering secrets to those who listen long enough. No one interrupts. Every breath, every heartbeat is attuned to the rhythm of the voice. In a world without clocks, these tales were how time moved. They filled the emptiness between dusk and dawn, transforming silence into meaning. For early humans, stories were not entertainment, they were survival strategies disguised as memory. A tale about a wolf spirit might hold warnings about hunting in packs. A legend about the frozen moon could encode knowledge of weather cycles. The stories that lasted were the ones that helped people stay alive. But beyond practical wisdom, stories gave shape to fear. They turned the unseen into the understood. The moaning of wind became a restless ancestor. The cracking of ice was a spirit breaking free. By giving names to the unknown, people regained a small measure of control. Fear that could be spoken was fear that could be survived. Every culture in the frozen world had its keepers of stories. In the far north, the Inuit told of Sedna, the mother of the sea, whose moods decided whether hunters would find food. In the dark forests of Europe, they spoke of frost demons and forest queens who watched over lost travelers. In Central Asia, the yak herders shared songs about a sun-eating serpent that must be defeated anew each year. These tales were not isolated inventions. They were part of a single human pattern, a universal language of endurance. When the storms outside screamed against the walls, people told their stories louder. The sound of voices became a charm, a shield. Children fell asleep to the murmur of myths older than memory, and their dreams carried those images forward. In this way, the past was never lost. It was spoken into the next generation, carried on the same breath that once froze in the air. For many, the storyteller held the same sacred weight as the firekeeper. Both preserved light, one of flame, one of thought. And just as a single spark could reignite a hearth, a single story could rekindle hope. In the endless dark, a well-told tale was proof that life still had rhythm, that time still moved, and that meaning still existed beyond hunger and fear. The best storytellers understood silence as well as speech. They knew when to pause, when to let the wind fill the gap between words, when to let listeners drift half into dream. The cadence of their voice mimicked the crackle of fire, slow and hypnotic, carrying the listener into that space between sleep and waking, where imagination takes over. In that state, truth and legend blurred until they were indistinguishable. And sometimes, stories changed the way people felt the world. If a tale said that a certain mountain was sacred, they climbed it differently, slower, reverent. If it told of a spirit guarding the forest, they entered it with caution, gratitude, and awe. Words shaped behavior, and behavior shaped survival. The stories were invisible maps, guiding people through the wilderness of existence. Even now, thousands of years later, we can feel their echoes. The myths that once kept ancient families alive still drift in our collective memory in the fairy tales told to children, in the ghost stories shared around campfires. Each one is a spark from the same original flame. We tell them not because we need to know the world, but because we need to feel it to keep the dark from becoming too quiet. And as the nights stretched on, those ancient people found comfort in the repetition. The same words, spoken the same way, night after night. It wasn't just tradition, it was survival through rhythm. The mind learned to rest in the familiar patterns, the body to breathe in sync with the voice. Outside, the storms continued. The fire burned low. The world was frozen and vast. But inside, stories moved like warm air, circling, softening, keeping life alive. They didn't tell stories to pass time. They told them to keep the dark away. At first, hunger came quietly. It didn't arrive with panic or noise, but with a slow fading, the thinning of soup, the smaller portions, the subtle way hands lingered longer over a bowl before passing it on. The snow outside had long since buried everything that once lived. What was left inside the shelters began to shrink day by day, and with it, the warmth of certainty. The people had prepared as best they could. Dried meats hung from rafters, hard roots lay buried beneath packed earth, and small jars of rendered fat were guarded like gold. But even the best preparation was a guess, a fragile calculation against a season that could last longer than memory. There was no knowing whether the thaw would come in a month or many. So they rationed, cutting pieces thinner, stretching flavors, learning to make a meal from almost nothing. Hunger was not immediate pain, it was erosion. First came the dullness, the sense that everything, thoughts, movements, emotions took just a little more effort. People spoke less, conserving energy as though words themselves consumed calories. Firelight flickered on faces grown sharper, eyes sunken but still alert. The cold was easier to bear than the emptiness inside their bodies. At least the cold was visible. Hunger was invisible, patient and cruel. The elders felt it first. They were the ones who gave their portions away, quietly pushing food toward the younger ones when no one was watching. Sometimes they lied, saying they had eaten earlier. No one believed them, but no one called them out. It was a silent understanding, an exchange between generations, measured not in words, but in will. When the food ran low, ingenuity became the final weapon. They boiled bones until they cracked and released faint clouds of marrow. They scraped frozen fat from hides, chewed strips of leather softened over fire, turned bark into bitter flour. Nothing went to waste. Even the ash from the hearth was sifted, in case a scrap of edible fat had fallen into it. Survival became an act of creativity. Every gesture, every invention, a rebellion against extinction. Outside, the snow still fell. The forest animals had vanished, the rivers locked beneath glass. Sometimes, hunters ventured out despite the risk, moving ghost-like across the frozen landscape. Their steps made no sound. They returned hours or days later, carrying nothing but frost on their eyelashes. The world offered no mercy. In the deep cold, even the strongest hunter could become prey not to beasts, but to distance, exhaustion, and despair. And yet, within this quiet suffering, there was something extraordinary. Cooperation. Hunger could divide, but more often, it united. Families gathered tighter, sharing everything that remained. They told stories not of abundance, but of endurance, tales of ancestors who had faced the same despair and survived. In these stories, hunger became a test of spirit, not just flesh. The mind began to drift differently during those days. Thoughts slowed, slipping between dream and waking. Time lost its shape. People began to measure existence not in days or nights, but in fires fed and bowls emptied. The simplest act, breaking a frozen loaf, lighting a flame, sharing a morsel, became a ritual, a prayer. The worst part was not the pain, but the doubt, the fear that perhaps the sun would not return this time, that the frost would never melt, that they were the last living voices in a world gone still. In that silence, every sound mattered: the pop of burning wood, the whisper of fabric, the soft thud of falling snow. They listened, not for hope, but for proof that something still moved. One night, a hunter returned with a single bird, small, thin, barely worth the arrow that struck it. But when the firekeeper placed it on the flame, the smell filled the room like music. It wasn't enough to feed everyone, but it was enough to remind them that the world had not forgotten them. They passed the meat around in pieces so small they melted on the tongue, and for a moment, the hunger eased. Not from food, but from the warmth of being alive together. In the deepest hunger, the people discovered something paradoxical: that survival was not about having enough, but about not giving up when there wasn't. They learned that the human spirit could stretch thinner than the body and still hold. The cold could numb their fingers, but not their sense of belonging. By the time the food stores were nearly gone, they no longer feared hunger. It had become familiar, a quiet companion sitting beside the fire. They no longer spoke of it, they simply lived with it. Their strength was not measured in what they could eat, but in what they could endure without breaking. Outside, the frozen moon hung above a world asleep. Inside, the last embers glowed softly, and the people waited not with panic but with patience, because they understood something the modern world often forgets. Hunger is not just emptiness. It is the echo of life refusing to end. And as long as that echo remained, they knew somehow, impossibly, that spring would return. There came a point when food was no longer a memory but a myth, a story they told each other the way they once spoke of summer. When the hunger grew too deep to fight, people began to turn inward. They discovered that the body could endure more than they ever imagined, but the mind needed something greater than flesh to survive. And so began the strange, quiet art of eating nothing. In the first days without food, they still searched, scraping bark, melting snow for water, chewing on anything that could trick the mouth into remembering nourishment. But soon, searching gave way to stillness. The body slowed, movements became deliberate, almost ceremonial. The heartbeat steadied into a rhythm older than speech. People began to understand that hunger itself could be transformed, not erased, but redirected. Elders whispered that emptiness was sacred, that when the stomach ached long enough, the spirit began to open. They said the ancestors spoke clearest in hunger, that visions came when the body grew quiet enough to hear them. Across frozen lands, fasting became more than necessity, it became communication. The absence of food turned into a bridge between the living and the unseen. On certain nights, those too weak to move would close their eyes and drift somewhere beyond the firelight. They dreamed of warmth, of fruit and rivers, of soft earth under bare feet. But sometimes they dreamed of things no one could explain, shapes in the snow, lights that pulsed like breath, voices humming from beneath the ice. When they woke, they spoke of these visions in hushed tones, unsure whether they had seen the future or the past. Anthropologists might call it starvation hallucination, but to them it was revelation. The line between the two was thinner than frost. The act of fasting gave meaning to what might otherwise have been despair. People began to gather not for meals, but for silence. They would sit in circles, their hands resting in their laps, breathing in rhythm with the faint crackle of the fire. Someone might hum softly, a low note that trembled through the air like the sound of distant thunder. The vibration soothed the ache. It reminded them that the body was still alive, even as it forgot how to want. Some carved small figures out of bone or wood, spirits of plenty, guardians of patience. They placed them near the hearth as offerings, not prayers for food but for strength. Hunger was no longer the enemy, it was the teacher. It showed them what could be stripped away and what could not. The flesh weakened, but something in the spirit sharpened, clear as ice. There were moments when the fast turned ecstatic. The brain, deprived of fuel, began to shimmer with strange clarity. People described it as floating, as if the weight of the world had lifted. The air seemed brighter, the silence deeper. They began to sense a rhythm in everything, in the shifting of the flames, in the long breaths of those beside them, even in the groaning of the wind outside. It was as if, in the absence of food, they were being fed by something else, something invisible but vast. In this suspended state, some claimed to glimpse truths that vanished with the return of strength. They saw themselves from above, saw their ancestors standing behind them, saw the land stretching endlessly into darkness and light. These experiences were not madness. They were survival of a different kind, the mind adapting to keep meaning alive when the world offered nothing else. As days passed, hunger became rhythm. The first pang in the morning was a familiar visitor. The dizziness in the afternoon, a reminder of continuity. It was almost comforting. They no longer feared it because they understood it. Hunger could not kill what it did not possess the will to endure. When at last a scrap of food was found, a forgotten store of nuts, a trapped hare, a hidden cache buried under snow, no one rushed. They shared it slowly, reverently. The first bite was not greed but gratitude. Eating became sacred again, because it was rare. Every taste was a communion with life itself. Through this, they learned something profound. Survival was not only about what could be consumed, but about what could be transcended. To eat nothing and still remain alive was to prove that existence itself was more powerful than appetite. Outside, the frozen wind continued to sweep across the land. But inside those dim shelters, something invisible was taking root. A quiet resilience, patient and luminous, born from the art of waiting. They had not conquered hunger. They had learned to live with it, to listen to its silence, to hear within it the echo of something eternal. There always came one night when winter seemed endless, the night when even the strongest fires struggled to live, and the stars themselves appeared to shiver. It wasn't the first cold, or the deepest snow, but something different, a stillness so absolute that the air felt suspended between heartbeats. Later, the survivors would remember it simply as the coldest night. It began without warning. The temperature dropped faster than anyone had known before. Flames burned blue, smoke froze at the mouth of the hearth, and breath crystallized mid-air. The world outside disappeared into a silent white haze. The sound of wind faded, replaced by something stranger, a vast, ringing quiet that pressed against the ears like deep water. Even the wolves had vanished. Inside the shelters, the people gathered close. No one spoke. There was nothing left to say that the cold didn't already whisper. The firekeeper's hands trembled as they fed the last pieces of wood into the hearth. The embers flared briefly, then sank low, red as dying eyes. Around them, the shadows grew long and restless, moving in rhythm with the flickering light. For a moment, it seemed as though the darkness itself was breathing. They wrapped themselves in hides, pressed skin to skin, hoping body heat would defy the night. The air inside grew thick with smoke and fear. Outside, the snow piled higher, sealing them in. The roof creaked under its weight, a sound like the groan of the earth itself. Children whimpered softly, not from cold but from the sound that ancient, shifting moan of the world turning in its sleep. The old ones began to murmur prayers. Not to gods of summer or harvest, but to the spirits of endurance, the ancestors who had faced winters before. They believed that if they could stay awake, if they could keep the flame alive until dawn, the spirits would take pity. Every few moments, someone leaned forward to feed the fire, even when nothing was left to burn. A scrap of bark, a thread of rope, a memory. Hours passed, or perhaps entire days. Time had no meaning. The cold erased it. People drifted in and out of sleep, their dreams vivid and strange. Some dreamed of green fields and warm rivers. Others saw faces in the ice familiar, smiling, beckoning them away. Those who woke from such dreams cried silently, afraid that the vision had been too kind to resist a second time. At some point deep in that endless dark, the fire finally faltered. The last ember dimmed to a dull red, then winked out, leaving behind a darkness so complete it felt solid. For a moment, there was nothing. No sound, no breath, no thought. Just the cold, infinite, and merciless. And then, someone began to hum. The sound was fragile, almost inaudible, a vibration trembling in the still air. Another voice joined, then another, until the small shelter filled with low, wordless song. It wasn't music in any familiar sense. It was something older, the sound of life refusing to vanish. The rhythm steadied hearts, shared breath, bound them together in defiance. The cold didn't disappear, but it changed. It became part of them. They could feel it in their blood, but it no longer frightened them. The singing continued until voices cracked and faded, replaced by silence once again, but this time it was peaceful. When dawn finally came, it arrived without colour. The light was grey, pale as bone, and so faint that it barely touched the horizon. But it was enough. The ice on the windows glowed faintly, and the people stirred. Some wept softly, others just stared, too tired for joy. They had made it through the longest night, not because of strength or skill, but because they had chosen not to surrender. Outside, the world lay transformed. Trees bowed under snow, rivers shone like glass, and the sky stretched clear and endless. Everything looked fragile, as though one breath might shatter it. Yet in that silence was something new, a thin thread of warmth, almost invisible but real. They buried their dead quietly that morning, marking the graves with stones so they would not forget where love had once lived. Then they gathered wood, rekindled their fires, and ate what little remained. Each act was small, but sacred. Because survival, they realized, was not a single moment of triumph. It was 1,000 small choices made in the dark to keep breathing, to keep believing, to keep singing when there was nothing left to sing about. The coldest night had passed, and though it would return in years to come, they would always remember this one, the night humanity met the edge of death, and found warmth still burning in its heart. It didn't happen all at once. The end of winter never announced itself with trumpets or sudden light. It began with something almost invisible, a single drop of water. It fell from the eaves of a snow-covered shelter, struck the frozen ground, and vanished. Then another followed, and another. To those who had survived the long dark, The sound was as startling as thunder. The world, it seemed, was beginning to move again. For weeks, the cold had been absolute, a law written in silence. But one morning, the air felt different, softer. The wind, once sharp enough to cut, now carried a faint dampness. The snow no longer squeaked underfoot, it sighed. The people noticed before they believed. Their fires burned lower now, their bodies thin but alive, their eyes dulled by months of darkness. And yet, when they stepped outside, they could feel it. The change. The air no longer bit. It brushed. At first, no one dared to speak of it. Hope was dangerous. Hope could lie. But the thaw deepened quietly each day. Icicles wept into puddles. The rivers began to whisper beneath their glassy prisons. The ground, hard as stone for months, released a soft, wet scent, the first smell of earth. It was enough to make people weep without knowing why. The return of warmth was not sudden joy. It was disbelief. After endless cold, warmth felt almost like pain. Fingers unused to touch ached in the Sunday. Faces, long hidden beneath furs, flinched from the brightness. Children reached out and tried to catch the melting snow, laughing, then stopping, as if laughter itself might frighten the world back into winter. Every gesture was cautious, reverent, like waking a sleeping god. Animals were the first to trust it. Ravens returned, their wings cutting the grey sky. Then the deer appeared, thin and ghostly, stepping carefully through the slush. Tracks reappeared in the snow, and with them, a sense of movement, of direction. The land was no longer a tomb. It was breathing again. Inside the shelters, the people began to talk in full voices for the first time in months. They spoke of plans, of hunts, of gathering wood that wasn't frozen solid. They spoke of what had been lost, and what had somehow endured. The tone was hushed, not from fear, but from awe. Survival had changed them. The thaw was not a victory, it was grace. The first true sign came one morning when the sun broke through the clouds, weak but golden, spilling across the snow like liquid fire. No one moved at first. They simply watched. The light touched their faces, their hands, the roofs of their shelters. Steam rose where it met the frost, and for a moment the air shimmered with life. Someone laughed softly, a sound almost forgotten. Someone else began to cry. The old ones said the sun was testing them, making sure they were still worthy of its return. So they stood in silence, faces lifted, not worshipping but remembering. The light felt thin, fragile, as if it might fade again at any moment. But it didn't. Day after day, it grew a little stronger, a little warmer, until shadows began to form again, where before there had been only darkness. For the first time in months, they could see their breath disappear. Not freeze, not hang in the air disappear. It was the simplest proof that the world had shifted. The cold no longer owned the sky. Then came the sound of running water. At first it was faint, like a dream half remembered. But as days passed it grew louder, more insistent, the rivers waking from their sleep. The ice cracked and sang, releasing trapped air with small explosions that echoed through valleys. To hear water again was to remember life. It was the sound of forgiveness. Children began to play outside, their laughter echoing across the half-frozen ground. Hunters prepared their bows, their movements slower, almost ceremonial. The first tracks they followed weren't for meat but for confirmation. The world was alive again. Yet, not everything was the same. The thaw revealed what winter had hidden: bones, broken tools, the quiet evidence of those who hadn't made it. The survivors gathered what they found and placed them gently in the sun, whispering words of thanks. In that moment, warmth and grief intertwined. The light returned, but it did not erase what the dark had taught. They had survived, not because they were stronger than the cold, but because they had learned to listen to it, to live beside it, to understand that survival wasn't defiance, it was balance. And as the snow retreated and the rivers ran clear again, something within them thawed too. They began to dream differently, not of warmth or hunger or fear, but of the next world that spring would build. The people knew the winter would return someday. It always did. But now, they also knew that so would the Sunday. And for the first time in a long, long season, they believed it. When the world began to breathe again, the people did not rush into life. They approached it the way one approaches a sacred fire, with reverence and care. The thaw had not only softened the ground, it had softened their hearts. After months of silence, their voices returned slowly, uncertainly, as though afraid of disturbing something ancient and sleeping. The first warmth was not only physical, it was spiritual. It felt like waking inside a dream that wasn't entirely theirs. They called it the rebirth. But it was not just the land that was reborn, it was them. The rituals that followed were not written or planned. They emerged naturally, born from gratitude and memory. After surviving the long dark, every movement carried meaning. To step outside, to touch the soil, to breathe unfiltered air. Each act became a quiet ceremony of existence. The elders were the first to speak of the rites. They said that when the sun returned, the people must greet it, not with shouts, but with offerings, symbols of what they had endured. So they gathered at dawn, their faces thin but luminous in the pale light. They carried things that had kept them alive through the winter, pieces of wood from the hearth, shards of bone tools, scraps of fur. These were placed in a circle on the thawing ground, not to be burned or buried, but simply to rest under the sun's gaze. It was an exchange between survival and gratitude. Then came the washing. At the edge of the river, the ice had cracked open, revealing water that moved with hesitant freedom. One by one, people knelt and dipped their hands into it. The cold was unbearable, shocking after months of shelter, yet no one withdrew. They cupped the water, splashed it over their faces, and felt something more than cleansing, a renewal that reached into the soul. The water stung, but it was alive. It was proof that the earth still loved them enough to flow. Later, they lit new fires. Not the old coals, not the embers carried through the dark, but flames born fresh from spark and friction. The act itself felt sacred, light coaxed once more from the cold. They gathered around these flames in silence, watching them rise, thin and golden, twisting into the morning air. No one spoke of the ones who hadn't survived. Their memory was already there, in the light. Somewhere in the distance, drums began to sound soft, steady, echoing across the half-frozen plain. The rhythm was ancient, a heartbeat older than any language. Children danced first, their movements unsteady but full of life. Then the adults followed, their steps slow and solemn, each one acknowledging what had been lost and what had been returned. This was not celebration as we know it. It was communion, the joining of grief and joy, of endings and beginnings. As the sun climbed higher, its warmth touched faces turned upward. The people raised their hands, not in prayer, but in surrender, a gesture of acceptance that the world would always take and give in cycles. They understood now that winter had not been a punishment. It had been a passage, a descent into darkness that revealed what light truly meant. When the day ended, the people returned to their shelters, but they left the new fires burning outside. It was said that these flames would guide the wandering spirits home, those who had fallen during the cold. The smoke rose straight into the sky, carrying the scent of pine, bone, and renewal. Under the growing stars, the flames flickered and merged with the night wind, whispering like voices too old to name. That evening, for the first time in months, laughter returned, soft, hesitant, but real. Someone told a story about the sun being trapped beneath the world, freed by the song of children. Someone else sang a song that no one remembered learning. It drifted upward, mingling with the sparks, until it seemed the whole world was listening. In that moment, they understood something deeper than survival. To live through darkness was one kind of strength. But to open one's heart again after the dark, to risk feeling warmth, to risk hope, that was the truest act of courage. The rituals of rebirth would change over centuries, growing into myths, festivals, and faiths. But their meaning would remain the same, that no matter how long the night, the sun always remembers the way home. And in that promise, whispered through fire and river and breath, humanity found its oldest comfort, the assurance that life, in all its frailty, always returns. Winter wasn't their enemy, it was their greatest teacher. Every frozen night, every breath of frost that burned the lungs, every hunger that hollowed the body, all of it was a lesson, written not in ink, but in ice. For those who survived, knowledge didn't come from words or books. It came from the land itself. It came from watching, listening, and remembering what the cold had shown them. When the thaw finally arrived, people didn't just emerge from their shelters, they emerged wiser. The memory of winter lived inside them like a second heartbeat, a quiet rhythm of caution and respect. They had learned that no one survived alone. The cold had stripped away illusion, revealing the truth that survival was never about the strongest, but about the most connected. Across continents, this understanding echoed. In the Arctic, Inuit families built snow shelters so precise that even the smallest space trapped warmth architecture born from patience and observation. In northern Europe, ancient communities stored grain in shared cellars beneath frozen soil, trusting each other to take only what they needed. In Central Asia, nomads moved with the seasons, not against them, carrying their lives on their backs like living calendars. Everywhere, the lesson was the same. To endure, humanity had to cooperate not just with one another, but with nature itself. Winter demanded humility. The people learned that control was an illusion. You could prepare, you could plan, but you could never command the sky. The frost didn't bargain, and the sun didn't apologize. To live through it meant accepting your smallness and finding strength within that acceptance. There was a kind of peace in it, a balance between awe and surrender. They also learned creativity and constraint. When the land stopped giving, they learned to make something from nothing, to invent, to adapt. The first sewing needles, made from bone. The first insulated clothing, crafted from layers of fur and grass. The first preserved foods, dried in smoke that carried both flavor and hope. Necessity didn't just force survival, it sparked imagination. In the silence of the frozen world, invention was a form of prayer. And so, winter shaped not just their bodies, but their minds. It made them cautious, but curious, fearful, yet inventive. It taught rhythm, the rhythm of patience, the rhythm of return. They understood that all life moved in cycles, warmth and cold, light and dark, abundance and hunger. The frost wasn't punishment, it was punctuation, the pause that gave meaning to the sentence of life. Even their myths reflected the lessons of the ice. The gods they worshipped were not distant rulers, but mirrors of the elements, storm spirits, frost mothers, sun bearers, and river guardians. Their stories reminded them that nature was not something to conquer, but something to live within. In their rituals, they thanked both the sun for returning and the winter for its wisdom. Because without the dark, they would never have known the value of light. When we look back now, thousands of years later, we can still see those lessons buried in our collective memory. We light candles in winter because we once worshipped fire. We gather for warmth and food because we once knew hunger. Even our modern comforts, our homes, our calendars, our sense of time are echoes of ancient survival. Beneath the noise of civilization, the rhythm of winter still beats quietly, reminding us of who we are when everything else is stripped away. In every age, when the world seems too harsh, when scarcity and silence return in new forms, humanity repeats the same ritual. We come together, we create, we endure. The ice may no longer cover the earth as it once did, but the lessons remain. They are carved into our instincts: cooperation, humility, resilience, gratitude. And perhaps that is the true secret of the long dark, that survival was never only about staying alive. It was about learning how to live with the world, not against it. Even now, when snow falls outside our windows, when we light a fire or sip something warm, a part of us remembers. We remember the endless night, the firekeeper's hands, the silence that once held the world. We remember that everything we have, warmth, shelter, safety, began as a fragile flame in the dark. The ice has melted, but its wisdom endures. Because winter was never just a season. It was a teacher. And humanity, fragile, stubborn, luminous, was its greatest student. They didn't build houses, they built fire into walls. Long before there were cities or villages, before wood and stone became architecture, there were circles of warmth carved into the frozen earth. The first homes were not monuments. They were promises quiet, flickering sanctuaries in a world ruled by wind and ice. The earliest of them were half buried, pressed deep into the soil like wombs. Their entrances faced away from the wind, narrow and low, forcing anyone who entered to bow not by command, but by instinct. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of smoke and soil, the soft musk of fur. The walls, lined with hides and moss, absorbed the sound of the storm outside. The earth itself became insulation, holding the warmth close. Archaeologists have found their traces across the world in the tundras of Siberia, in the high plains of Europe, in the frozen coastlines of the Arctic. Shallow pits with blackened stone circles, bones arranged in patterns, fragments of burnt clay where fires once burned steady and slow. Each site tells the same story, humanity learning to shape the cold instead of flee from it. In those small, dim shelters, life condensed into rhythm. The fire crackled softly, echoing off the low ceilings. Children whispered in sleep. The slow breathing of animals mixed with that of their keepers. Every sound mattered, every pop of sap in the firewood, every shift of fur against stone. The hearth was the center of everything, both physically and spiritually. It was where food was made, where stories were told, where the darkness was kept at bay. The first architects weren't engineers, they were guardians of warmth. The designs grew more refined as generations passed. What began as shallow pits became deep, interconnected dwellings, their roofs covered with earth and snow to trap heat. Some were reinforced with mammoth bones, forming curved frames draped with hides, structures strong enough to outlast entire seasons. Others used stone slabs and driftwood, sealed with clay and moss. Every material had purpose. Every curve of wall had memory. To step into one of those ancient homes, even in reconstruction, is to feel something primal, awaken a quiet hum beneath the ribs, a reminder that warmth is not just comfort, but connection. You can almost hear the echoes of hands working in silence, arranging, weaving, building. The smell of smoke lingers, mingled with the scent of fat lamps and damp fur. The air feels alive, heavy with the breath of those who once huddled there, surviving not through strength but through ingenuity. In Siberia, remains of dwellings have been found where the fire pits were placed with perfect precision, the center aligned to distribute heat evenly through the chamber. In the Arctic, the Inupiat and their ancestors built semi-subterranean homes called karmaks, with tunnels that trapped cold air before it could enter the main living space. In northern Europe, longhouses emerged, wooden ribs bound by thatch and clay, big enough to hold entire families, their animals, and their stories. Every beam, every groove, was a response to the same eternal question: how do we keep the flame alive? These homes were more than protection from the cold. They were the first expressions of belonging. The walls held not just heat, but memory. They were painted, carved, and sometimes marked with the soot of ritual fires. In their glow, community was born, not through words, but through shared breath and shared survival. The warmth they built was layered. Physical warmth radiated from fire and stone. Emotional warmth flowed from touch, from laughter, from the quiet reassurance of presence. To live through winter was to understand that warmth was the true currency of life, the pulse that kept meaning alive when the world froze outside. There was art in the way they arranged space. The closer one sat to the fire, the more sacred their duty. The elders, the storytellers, the firekeepers, they sat near the center. The young and restless played at the edges, where shadows moved like spirits across the walls. Beyond that circle lay the world of the dead, the endless frost. Inside was the world of the living, soft, bright, fragile. Sometimes, during long storms, the fires burned without rest for days. The air would grow thick with smoke, and they would poke holes through the roof, letting the wind draw the breath of the earth upward. It must have looked like prayer, thin ribbons of grey spiraling into the sky. From outside, the snow-covered mounds seemed like sleeping giants, glowing faintly from within. From inside, it felt like living inside a heartbeat. When archaeologists unearthed these sites thousands of years later, they found more than tools or ashes. They found evidence of emotion. Hearths carefully maintained even after their owners had moved on. Charred bones placed in patterns that spoke of ritual, not waste. Fragments of carved bone charms, small suns, hands, spirals left near the fire. These weren't random debris. They were offerings to the flame, acknowledgements of the fragile alliance between humans and heat. To build warmth was to build meaning. Each shelter was a statement. We will not be erased. Over time, those principles expanded. The longhouse became the village. The pit house became the hall. The circle of warmth grew wider, but its soul remained the same: the gathering, the sharing, the creation of safety through flame and proximity. Even now, When we sit by a fireplace or light a candle in the dark, we are repeating their gesture, honouring the first homes of heat. The walls may have changed, the fires smaller, but the essence endures. It is the same warmth that held them through the long dark, the same invisible bond that has carried us across millennia. Because warmth was never just about fire. It was about belonging. And that, more than any invention, was the beginning of civilization. In the cold, they learned that warmth was something you could build together. At first, there were only single shelters, lonely mounds of earth, glowing faintly in the night. But over time, something remarkable began to happen. The dwellings drew closer. One fire became 2, then 10, until an entire valley pulsed with small red hearts of light. From these clusters of flame, the first villages were born. Archaeologists have uncovered their traces, circles of pits and hearths in Dolní Věstonice, in the frozen plains of Moravia, longhouses buried under layers of frost in Scandinavia, reindeer bone walls, and shared ovens in the Arctic tundra. These were not accidents of convenience. They were the beginnings of something new, warmth multiplied through connection. Each house was its own universe, yet the spaces between them mattered most. The people built walkways of packed snow, low windbreaks of bone and hide, tunnels connecting entrances so that no one would have to face the storm alone. They designed their world around the flow of heat and sound, where the fire's glow could reach, laughter could follow. The frozen earth became a map of cooperation, drawn in ash and footprints. When the cold came heavy and absolute, they gathered in the largest shelter, the communal house. It stood like a heart at the center of the village, its roof low, its walls layered with hides and clay. Inside, multiple fires burned at once, their light mingling into a single golden haze. The air was thick with smoke, and the smell of fat melting over stone. It was here that humanity learned its oldest comfort, to be many and warm together. Every sound inside those walls told a story of unity. The crackle of fire became rhythm, the murmur of voices became song, the scraping of tools and the breathing of animals joined the pulse of the flame. Children slept in clusters near the heat, dreaming beneath shadows that danced across fur-lined ceilings. The elders spoke softly, their words rising with the smoke lessons about patience, about gratitude, about how the fire never belonged to one person but to all. In those gatherings, something invisible changed in the human mind. Warmth stopped being a private thing. It became communal, an energy that expanded when shared. They learned that a single person could not survive the winter, but a village could. Every task, every gesture, became a thread in a larger web of endurance. Someone tended the fires. Someone fetched wood. Someone mended hides. Together, they turned survival into ceremony. The villages under frost were not only about shelter, they were about spirit. In their design, you can feel intention, the human instinct to draw close when the world grows cold. Each hearth was positioned, so its light reached the next. Each doorway was angled so the wind would carry warmth rather than steal it. Even silence was shared, the quiet comfort of knowing someone else was awake, watching the flames, guarding the night. Dolní Věstonice offers one of the clearest glimpses into that life. Beneath layers of silt and frost, archaeologists found mammoth bones arranged like ribs, the remains of walls that once encircled an entire community. Inside were hearths blackened with soot, fragments of clay figures, animals, humans, shapes that blurred the line between both. These were not crude shelters, they were laboratories of imagination. Each person's hands had contributed to their making, each fire a small act of collective defiance against the void. The cold became a teacher of empathy. When the frost pressed too hard, people didn't retreat inward, they reached outward. They shared not just food or warmth, but presence. The sick were kept near the fire's center. The strong took the cold edges of the shelter. To protect others was to protect the whole. This was not kindness, it was logic written in ice. And in that logic, something astonishing began to form. Society. The boundaries between survival and kinship blurred. Fire was no longer just heat. It was symbol, memory, belonging. To sit together meant to exist together. To share warmth meant to share identity. In the long nights, as the wind howled over their sleeping mounds, the glow of the village was a constellation of human endurance, a man-made galaxy flickering against the endless black. From a distance, it must have looked almost celestial. each hearth a small star proving that life still burned on Earth. When dawn finally crept back, it revealed not scattered survivors, but a network of them, a new form of humanity, bound by the architecture of warmth. The cold had given them no choice but to evolve, and they did not by conquering the elements, but by uniting against them. From these frozen villages came everything that followed: language, art, cooperation, faith, all born from the same simple truth, that survival was not a solitary act. It was something built, hand by hand, breath by breath, in the glow of shared fire. Every stitch was a heartbeat against extinction. Before clothing was beauty, before it was identity or ornament, it was survival, raw, deliberate, and sacred. Long before the first loom or spindle, humans shaped warmth not from walls or fires, but from themselves. They learned that the body could become its own shelter, that protection could be carried, not just built. The first garments were not sewn, they were imagined. Skins thrown over shoulders, woven grass pressed against the wind, bark softened by smoke and water until it could bend without breaking. These were not decorations, they were declarations. Each layer said, "I will endure." Archaeologists have found traces of that early ingenuity in the frozen soils of Siberia, in the caves of France, in the permafrost of Alaska, bone needles carved as finely as modern tools, their eyes small and perfect, their tips worn smooth by countless passes through hide. Some are over 30,000 years old. They were instruments of survival, not fashion tools that turned death into life, animal into warmth, necessity into art. The process was brutal and beautiful. After a hunt, when an animal's spirit was thanked and its flesh used for food, its skin became a canvas of endurance. Women and men scraped the hides with stone blades, stretching them taut across wood frames, rubbing them with fat and smoke to soften the fibers. The smell was sharp, oily, unforgettable, the scent of transformation. Some hides were layered with moss or feathers, others were lined with fur turned inward, trapping air close to the body. Each layer held a logic: skin to shield, fur to warm, breath to live. The making of clothing became ritual. Around the fire, families worked in silence, sewing, twisting, knotting, inventing. A single garment could take days, even weeks. The thread, spun from sinew or plant fiber, had to be strong enough to resist both motion and frost. Each puncture of the needle was a decision, a rhythm: push, pull, breathe. The sound of it was like the whisper of survival itself. In places where resources were scarce, nothing was wasted. Fish bones became fasteners, bird skins became gloves. Grasses and reeds, braided tightly, were woven into mats that could be wrapped or worn. The cold forced the imagination to expand in directions comfort would never have allowed. To survive meant to invent, to merge instinct with craftsmanship. But these garments did more than preserve warmth. They preserved identity. Each tribe, each small band, developed its own ways of cutting, stitching, layering. Some stitched with decorative seams that doubled as strength. Others pressed patterns into hides with heated stones, not for beauty alone, but as symbols of continuity, reminders of who they were in a world that could erase them overnight. The markings became their language when words were scarce. To wear such a garment was to wear survival itself. It held the smell of smoke, the sound of the wind outside, the memory of the hunt, the warmth of another's labour. When you wrapped yourself in fur or fibre, you weren't just covering skin, you were joining a lineage of endurance. Some clothing was made not only for the living, but for the dead. In burials across the Ice Age world, archaeologists have found figures wrapped carefully in layers, adorned with beads carved from ivory and shells. Even in death, warmth mattered. It was a final kindness, a gesture that said, "May you never feel the cold again." Over generations, these simple acts evolved into systems: fur over hide, hide over fibre, moisture trapped and redirected, heat reflected and retained. Long before thermodynamics, humanity had already mastered insulation through intuition. Clothing became technology, long before the word existed. In the Arctic, the ancestors of the Inuit perfected double-layered garments of sealskin and caribou hide, designed so moisture could escape while warmth stayed trapped within. In the steppes of Eurasia, hunters stitched fur-lined boots so precise that their feet could endure blizzards without frostbite. In the Alps, a man now called Utsi was found preserved in ice, his body still wearing layers of grass cloak, leather tunic, and fur cap, the echoes of innovation frozen in time. Every seam of his clothing told a story of someone who refused to die quietly. These were not primitive solutions. They were masterpieces of adaptation, made by people who understood that the difference between freezing and living lay in the smallest details: the angle of a stitch, the thickness of a thread, the direction of fur. Each choice carried the weight of survival. And as the firelight glowed on their faces, as the night winds howled beyond their shelters, those hands blistered, chapped, unstoppable, stitched a future from the cold. Because in the end, every garment was a map of resilience, a second skin crafted by human will. Wrapped in survival, they became something more than animal, more than fragile. They became the architects of warmth itself, carrying the flame not in walls, but upon their backs. They didn't fight the cold, they learned to live inside it. For most of us, the Arctic seems like a border of the world, a place where life ends, where nothing human should endure. But for thousands of years, people have not only survived there, they've thrived. The Inuit, the Chukchi, the Nenets, names carried by wind and snow across the top of the world, mastered one of the planet's harshest classrooms. They did it not through conquest, but through harmony, listening to the land until it spoke back. To understand their genius, you must first understand their silence. The Arctic is not empty. It hums with sound if you know how to hear it: the groan of ice shifting beneath the wind, the distant call of a seal surfacing, the rhythm of snow beneath fur boots. The people who lived here learned to read these sounds like words, each one a signal of life or danger. In a landscape without walls or trees, hearing became a form of sight. The igloo, perhaps the most misunderstood creation of all, is a perfect example of Arctic intelligence. To the untrained eye, it is a snow dome, fragile and temporary. But in truth, it is one of the most efficient architectural designs ever conceived. Built from blocks of packed snow, each one cut and placed in a spiraling curve, it traps heat without collapsing. The secret lies in air-tiny crystals that hold warmth like feathers. Inside, the temperature can rise from freezing to near-room warmth, powered only by a small lamp or body heat. The dome shape distributes weight evenly, allowing it to stand firm even in gales that could tear through metal. Within the igloo, everything had meaning. The sleeping platform, raised slightly higher than the entrance, kept cold air low and warmth around the body. The single opening faced away from prevailing winds. Even the light from the seal oil lamp, soft, flickering, golden, was placed not just for illumination but for balance. To enter one was to step into a work of living geometry, crafted by hands that had measured the breadth of the earth itself. But the Arctic engineers built more than homes. They built relationships. The Chukchi and Nenets, further west, shaped their entire existence around reindeer. They were not livestock in the modern sense. They were kin, companions, and lifelines. A herd was warmth, movement, and meaning all at once. The people followed them across tundra and ice, building their tents chums from the very hides of the animals that sustained them. Each migration was a choreography perfected over generations: when to move, where to graze, when to rest. It was not dominance, it was dialogue. Their tools, too, spoke the language of snow. Harpoons carved from antler, sleds bound with rawhide, blades made of sharpened bone or driftwood. Every shape was an answer to a question the cold had asked. The Arctic offered nothing freely, so they learned to take only what they could return. Waste was a sin the land would not forgive. The hunter's rule was simple: leave no hunger, leave no harm. And yet, amid all this precision and restraint, there was beauty. Clothing stitched from caribou skin with fur turned inward, breathable, waterproof, impossibly warm. Boots lined with grass that absorbed moisture. Parkas designed so perfectly that modern designers still copy their seams. When the Inuits sewed, they did not follow patterns. They followed instinct, measuring warmth with touch and intuition. Every garment was unique, a living collaboration between person, animal, and season. In these cultures, warmth was not just a physical state, it was a moral one. To hoard heat was to betray the community. Fire and food were shared, always. Children were taught early that the world owed them nothing but offered everything if treated with respect. There was no word for wilderness, because nothing was wild. Everything had spirit, everything belonged. When outsiders finally arrived, explorers wrapped in metal and wool, They struggled to understand how people could live where they could barely survive a month. They called them primitive. Yet it was these so-called primitives who saved them, teaching them how to find water in ice, how to read clouds for storms, how to breathe in cold so that lungs would not freeze. The Arctic, it turned out, did not forgive arrogance, but it rewarded understanding. The true brilliance of the Arctic engineers was not in invention, but in restraint. They built nothing unnecessary, wasted nothing, destroyed nothing they could not rebuild. Their architecture dissolved naturally into the landscape. Their sleds left no scars. Their traditions carried knowledge more enduring than steel, a wisdom that balances strength, not excess. When you look at an igloo glinting under moonlight, or hear the creak of a reindeer harness against the wind, you are hearing the echoes of that philosophy. A civilization that rose not by resisting nature, but by becoming part of it. And in that merging human and ice, fire and wind, they achieved something rare, a form of technology that left no shadow. They proved that mastery need not mean domination, that survival, at its highest form, is not an act of war against the world, but a conversation with it. The cold was not their enemy. It was their teacher, and they listened. Every footprint they left in the snow was a map of survival. Beyond the blinding plains of the Arctic, where the horizon swallows the sun, the world softens into forests, endless cathedrals of pine and birch, where snow falls slower and the wind hums instead of howls. Here lived the forest nomads, the Sami of northern Europe, the Evenki of Siberia, the early Slavic peoples who moved like whispers through the trees. While the tundra taught endurance, the forest taught rhythm. To live here meant not to fight the world, but to move in time with its breath. Their lives followed migration not of conquest, but of communion. Reindeer were their compass, their calendar, and their kin. When the herds moved north to graze, the people followed, carrying their shelters and stories with them. When winter deepened and the lichen disappeared beneath ice, they turned south again, always circling, always listening. The forest gave, but only to those who understood its quiet language. Their homes were made to move. The Sami built the lavu, a tent of poles and skins that could rise or fall with the day's needs. The Evenki raised the chum, a conical dwelling that shed snow as easily as a pine bough. Inside, smoke rose through the centre, and light flickered against the hides, tracing patterns like constellations. At night, when the fire dimmed, the wind outside blended with the breathing of reindeer. One heartbeat spread across the forest floor. They carried little because the forest carried them. Every object had purpose. Every material was sacred. Antlers became tools. Birch bark became containers, snowshoes, and vessels for boiling water. They tanned hides with tree sap, stitched clothes with sinew, and burned resin for light. Their survival wasn't invention, it was interpretation. They looked at what the land offered and learned to see its hidden design. The forest nomads lived in movement, but never in haste. Each journey was measured by the rhythm of snow, the call of migrating birds, the scent of thawing earth. Time was not a number. It was a feeling, the weight of the air, the tilt of the Sunday. When the first frost appeared on the trees, it wasn't fear they felt, but recognition. The cycle was returning, and they were part of it. In their world, warmth was a shared act. Fire burned at the heart of every camp, and around it, stories flowed. Tales of reindeer spirits who guided hunters, of forest gods who protected the sleeping herds. These weren't myths of domination, they were lessons wrapped in wonder. To disrespect the forest was to lose its favour. To waste a life was to unbalance the world. And so, the people took only what was needed, and left offerings of bone and branch behind, soft prayers pressed into snow. Even their clothing mirrored the forest's patience. Tunics made of layered hides, stitched with patterns of the northern lights, boots lined with moss and fur, light enough to glide across snowdrifts. Every seam had purpose, every knot remembered a hand. And when the winds grew cruel, they gathered closer, wrapping themselves not just in fur but in each other's breath. There was music, too haunting, slow, and ancient. The Sami called it joik, a song that did not describe something, but became it. A person could joik a mountain, a friend, or the memory of a hunt. To sing was to transform, to connect the living to everything that had come before. In those songs, warmth moved through sound, invisible but sustaining. The forest people did not measure wealth in possessions. Their treasure was movement, adaptability, memory. They lived in circles of migration, of season, of trust. And in those circles, civilization found a new definition. Not walls or boundaries, but continuity. When the snow fell thickest, when even the stars hid behind the clouds, the nomads gathered in their tents, tending the fire until the first blue light of dawn crept through the smoke hole. There, in that dim glow, children learned the oldest lesson of the forest, that survival was not about fighting nature, but remembering that they belonged to it. Centuries later, many of these traditions still survive. Reindeer herders still follow the same paths across Lapland and Siberia. The joik still drifts through the pine forests at twilight. And in those sounds, you can still hear the echo of that ancient wisdom that the world does not need to be conquered to be lived in. The forest nomads remind us of something modern life often forgets, that comfort is not the opposite of hardship, but the balance within it. They moved through a world of frost and silence, and found there a home more profound than any city could build. Because to them, the earth itself was a shelter, and the snow, far from being an enemy, was the blanket that made their world whole. When science failed, they prayed not for warmth, but for mercy. For those who lived their lives beneath endless winter skies, the cold was not just weather, it was presence. It breathed, it listened, it watched. The snow had moods, the wind had voices, and every storm carried intention. In such a world, people did not speak of nature as something separate from themselves. They spoke of spirits, unseen beings who shaped the frost and carried the firelight from camp to camp. To name them was to survive them. In the far north, the Inuit told of Sela, the great breath of the sky, an invisible force that governed weather, life, and thought. It was not God in the way we imagine, but balance itself, a living awareness that tested the strength of all things. Hunters whispered to Sela before stepping onto thin ice, offering a sliver of meat or a quiet song. If the ice cracked, they did not curse, they apologized, believing the spirit had been offended. In that humility lay survival. Across the sea, among the Sami and the ancient Norse, winter took other shapes. They spoke of frost giants, beings older than the gods themselves, born from the first ice that formed when the universe began. These giants were not evil, only vast, reminders of the cold's power and the fragility of warmth. The sagas say that when the frost giants stirred, storms followed. But even they were part of the great cycle, a necessary balance to the fire of life. In Siberia, the Evenki and the Nenets believed the snow itself was alive, made of the souls of ancestors who had returned to watch over the living. When the flakes drifted softly at night, elders would step outside and speak to them, thanking the spirits for their protection. Each snowstorm became a gathering of memory, 1,000 silent visitors returning from the past. These myths were not superstition, they were emotional maps. When darkness lasted for months, when hunger blurred the line between hope and despair, stories gave structure to fear. To imagine a frost god was to give form to the unknown. To offer a song was to reclaim agency in a world ruled by silence. Faith was not about control, it was about endurance. Rituals emerged from that understanding. The Chukchi would scatter reindeer hair into the wind before a hunt, asking the storm to stay its hand. The Sami built tiny altars of snow and stone, pouring drops of fish oil for the spirits of the mountain. Even the simple act of lighting a fire became sacred, a declaration that life still glowed against the darkness. Each flame was a prayer made visible. Winter festivals, too, were born from these beliefs. When the sun began to return after the long night, people danced and sang to coax it higher. Torches were carried across frozen lakes, their reflections trembling on the ice like twin suns. Laughter and drumming echoed through the cold, pushing back the shadows with rhythm and warmth. For one night, the darkness was not feared, it was celebrated, honored as the thing that had made the light meaningful. If you listen closely to these stories, a pattern emerges. Whether in the Arctic, the forests, or the steppes, humanity responded to the same truth. Survival required reverence. Those who treated the world as sacred endured. Those who tried to conquer it vanished. The myths were memory warnings written in song and symbol, carried through generations. Even now, their echoes remain. The frost giants have faded into legend, Sela into silence, but the instinct behind them survives. We still name storms, we still whisper before danger, We still build rituals to explain what we cannot control. In our own way, we still pray for mercy, though we call it luck, faith, or fate. The spirits in the snow remind us that belief was once as essential as fire. It kept the mind warm when the body trembled. It turned fear into meaning, darkness into story, isolation into connection. For in the heart of every myth lies a human truth. When the cold presses too hard, the imagination becomes the final refuge. And perhaps that is the oldest wisdom of all, that warmth is not only something we build with hands, but something we keep alive in the stories we tell to survive the night. When darkness lasted too long, they began to see things that weren't there. In the ancient winters, when the nights stretched endlessly and time lost its rhythm, the human mind faced its most silent predator itself. There were months when the sun didn't rise, when the horizon glowed faintly for an hour and then sank again into shadow. Fires burned low, conversation dwindled, and in the stillness, something began to stir, not outside, but within. Anthropologists call it winter madness, a term too simple for something so profound. For the people who lived through it, it wasn't a medical condition, it was an encounter with the edges of the mind. In isolation and cold, with the wind as their only constant sound, the boundary between dream and waking blurred. Shadows took on shape. The eyes invented movement. A voice might call from the darkness, sometimes familiar, sometimes not. It wasn't madness in the sense of chaos. It was more like a slow unraveling, a slipping of perception. The body remained still, but the imagination began to wander where footsteps couldn't. The ancient hunters of the Arctic spoke of hearing their ancestors whispering in the snowdrifts. Forest people described glowing figures that followed them between trees. In caves across Europe, paintings of spirits and hybrid creatures may have been born from visions like these. Not hallucinations as we define them, but something deeper, an attempt to speak with the silence. Darkness reshaped time. Without light, days bled into one another, and memory lost its sharpness. People marked hours by the burning of a single log, by the fading of embers, by the rhythm of their own breath. Sleep came in fragments. Dreams crept into waking life. The mind, starved for variation, began to invent its own. For some, it was terror. For others, revelation. Modern researchers studying long polar nights have found the same effects. Hallucinations, slowed thought, shifting moods, a deep sensory deprivation that bends consciousness. But for ancient people, these weren't symptoms to be cured. They were experiences to be interpreted. The mind was not breaking, it was listening. In this fragile mental space, the seeds of ritual and religion took root. When someone saw lights dancing over the horizon, they did not think of magnetic storms. They saw souls, the ancestors moving across the sky. When a whisper rose from the wind, they did not doubt it, they answered. The human mind, isolated in darkness, reached outward and built meaning from what it couldn't explain. It was not a weakness. It was survival. In long winters, families told stories not just for entertainment, but for protection. Words kept thought tethered to the real. To stop speaking was dangerous. Silence could swallow you whole. The stories filled the void tales of spirits, of stars, of rebirth. Through narrative, the mind anchored itself. Even now, when we whisper bedtime stories or talk to ourselves in the dark, we echo that same instinct, to keep reality stitched together with sound. There are written accounts from later Arctic explorers who noted how easily isolation turned eerie. One described feeling watched for days by something that moved only when I blinked. Another swore he heard a voice humming through the ice. These experiences weren't unique to modern minds, they were inherited responses, echoes of the same darkness our ancestors faced. And yet, from that psychological tension came beauty. Art born in caves, chants hummed in darkness, symbols carved into bone, all attempts to hold on to meaning when light disappeared. When the outer world froze, people turned inward, using imagination as a hearth. Vision became warmth. It's possible that much of early human spirituality, our belief in unseen forces, our yearning for the eternal began here, in the pressure of long winter nights. The isolation that could have destroyed us instead awakened a new sense, the ability to find connection without sight, to feel presence without proof. The cold stripped away distraction. All that remained was the flicker of fire, the breath of others, and the sound of thought echoing in the skull. Some called it madness, others communion. The boundary between both was thin as frost. And perhaps this is the truth of the winter mind, that when left alone too long with its fears, it begins to create beauty as a shield. Out of despair it makes myth. Out of silence it builds song. Out of loneliness it invents gods. Because when the world outside falls quiet, the imagination steps forward to keep us company. It always has. When words failed, rhythm remembered for them. After months of silence and isolation, when the cold had stripped the world of colour and sound, something stirred in the dark. A pulse, faint at first, like the heartbeat of the earth itself. Someone began to hum. Perhaps it was a mother, rocking a child beside the fire. Perhaps it was a hunter, keeping time while shaping a bone tool. Whatever its beginning, that sound became the thread that kept the mind from unravelling. In the long winters, rhythm was survival. The cold could silence voices, freeze movement, slow thought. But rhythm gave the body something to hold on to when meaning began to slip. It was the heartbeat of time returning. One strike of a drum, one hum, one foot tapping against the ground, it reminded the frozen world that life was still moving underneath. Anthropologists studying Ice Age sites have found traces of ancient instruments, flutes, carved from bird bone, hollowed reindeer antlers used as horns, small percussion stones blackened by smoke. These were not made for celebration or art in the modern sense. They were anchors for the mind. In darkness, where speech could dissolve into echo, music gave shape to existence. Even before, language had rhythm, rhythm had meaning. It steadied the breath. It echoed the pulse. It turned fear into pattern. When the storm howled outside and the wind clawed at the roof, the people inside could answer with sound drumming softly on wood, chanting in low tones, their voices blending with the storm rather than resisting it. Through that merging, they found peace. Across cultures, the same instinct emerged. The Sami used drums marked with sacred symbols, each beat calling the world back into balance. The Inuit created songs to speak to the spirits of the hunt, using repetition to bridge the gap between seen and unseen. In Siberia, shamans beat drums until trance took over, not madness, but alignment, the body syncing with something vast and invisible. These sounds weren't entertainment. They were architecture for the soul. When the walls shook with wind, the beat steadied the room. When thoughts wandered toward despair, rhythm pulled them back. It was sound as structure, a reminder that there was still an order beneath the chaos. The lullaby may have been humanity's first medicine. Its function was simple but profound, to convince the listener and the singer that everything would be all right. The words didn't matter. It was the tone, the slow rise and fall, the imitation of a heartbeat. In every ancient camp, in every frozen shelter, those soft songs held the night together. They told the darkness, "You may surround us, but you will not silence us." Even in the harshest climates, there were gatherings, small circles of people humming or drumming in unison. The sound carried warmth, shared and invisible. It didn't just comfort, it synchronized. Studies today show how group rhythm aligns, breathing, pulse, even emotion. Our ancestors didn't know the science, but they knew the feeling that to share rhythm was to share strength. Over generations, these simple sounds evolved into chants and myths. They became the foundation of oral tradition, ways to remember hunts, genealogies, the movements of stars. But their purpose remained the same, to keep memory alive when paper and ink didn't exist, to hold knowledge in melody, because melody could survive where words could not. Imagine it, a fire dimming low, shadows twisting across the walls. Outside, the wind moans like a ghost. Inside, someone begins to sing a slow, low tone that rises and falls like breath. Another voice joins, then another, until the air vibrates softly, and fear becomes rhythm, the dark becomes music. For a moment, the boundaries between people blur, and what remains is harmony, the sound of endurance itself. The songs didn't end when the thaw came. They became part of the human blueprint. Even now we hum without thinking when we're alone. We tap fingers when nervous. We find rhythm in footsteps, in rain, in the spinning of the earth itself. Music is the memory of survival, a reminder that sound once saved us when silence nearly destroyed us. It is easy to think of music as art, as luxury. But once, long ago, it was fire. It burned not in wood, but in air passed from mouth to mouth, heartbeat to heartbeat. And in that ancient darkness, when everything else froze, music stayed warm. They dreamed of a place where the sun never left, and some went searching. During the longest nights, when even the stars felt distant and the cold seeped into thought, people began to dream differently. The darkness became a stage for light. In their sleep, they saw forests without snow, rivers that never froze, skies that glowed for days without setting. They saw animals grazing on endless grass, oceans breathing in colours they had never known. These were not mere dreams, they were directions, whispers from the unconscious guiding the body toward life. For the ancient mind, a dream was never just imagination. It was message, omen, revelation. When waking hours offered only hunger and repetition, the dream became the only space where possibility survived. A hunter might wake convinced he had seen a valley of warmth waiting beyond the mountains. A mother might describe a land where her children played barefoot on soft soil. Slowly, those visions began to merge, to repeat across voices and generations, until they became myths, the first stories of paradise. Archaeologists studying early migration routes note something curious. The timing of humanity's great journeys often aligned with climatic despair. The Ice Age loosened its grip, glaciers retreated, and people began to follow rivers south and east. But long before the first foot moved, the journey had already begun inside the mind. They had dreamed their escape before they lived it. Anthropologists have found traces of this inner migration in symbols painted deep inside: caves, spirals, suns, flowing lines, shapes that seem to pulse with motion. Some believe these were not decorations but maps of memory, the mind's record of where warmth might lie. Each mark a promise, a reminder that there was something beyond the horizon, something worth believing in. To dream of the warm world was not weakness, it was instinct. Hope itself became a survival mechanism. In the silence of endless frost, hope was the only sound left quiet but relentless, whispering that movement was still possible. When food ran thin and nights grew longer, elders told stories of the lands their ancestors came, from places where water spoke, where fruit grew from trees that never slept. The younger ones listened, and in their hearts, the stories began to glow like embers. The imagination rehearsed escape. The body followed. Dream and decision blurred, and migration became not just necessity, but faith in motion. They packed their fires into baskets of bark, carried stone tools like relics, and began to walk. Each step southward, each ridge crossed, was guided as much by longing as by reason. They were following a vision, the collective dream of warmth. Not all found what they sought. Some journeys ended in deeper cold, in wastelands of ice and silence. But even in failure, the dreaming continued. The idea of a warm world became something larger than distance. It became eternity. Over time, it turned into the myths of heaven and renewal, of the afterlife as spring. In Norse sagas, after the frost of Ragnarok, a green world is reborn. In Siberian tales, the souls of the dead cross rivers of ice into meadows of Sunday. Everywhere, warmth was equated with return home, the soul remembered even when the body could not. Those ancient dreams shaped more than migration, they shaped meaning. To imagine warmth was to define what life should feel like: safety, abundance, light. These were not luxuries, they were coordinates of survival. Even now, when we close our eyes and think of peace, what we picture is warmth, a sunlit room, a gentle wind, a voice at ease. The oldest comfort we know. In that way, we are no different from them. Our dreams still follow the same rhythm, away from cold, toward light, away from silence, toward song. Each generation builds its own warm world through love, art, fire, or faith, because the memory of that longing lives in us all. Perhaps that is what evolution truly means. Not only the adaptation of body, but the persistence of imagination. The ability to see a world better than the one we wake into and to walk toward it. And so, as the ancient people lay in their shelters, surrounded by darkness and frost, their eyes closed not to escape, but to create. They dreamed of rivers running free, of golden light across the sea. They dreamed of spring, and in doing so, they summoned it. Because even when the body froze, the mind remembered warmth. And from that remembrance, the world began again. They didn't flee the cold forged them into travelers. It began not with choice, but with silence. The air changed first, thinner, sharper, heavy with frost. Animals vanished. Rivers froze until they became glass highways stretching into the distance. The trees stopped growing, their branches etched in white, and the stars seemed closer than the earth itself. Somewhere deep in time, the great cold descended, and the world began to move. In Europe, ice spread like a slow tide. Glaciers crawled down from the mountains, swallowing valleys and forests. The land that had once fed countless families turned to wasteland. The herds they hunted, mammoth, reindeer, auroch, began their own migration southward, and where the animals went, people followed. The first migrations were not marches of conquest, but of endurance. Families packed their shelters onto sleds of bone and hide. Fire was carried like treasure, glowing coals wrapped in moss and ash, guarded as fiercely as children. They crossed frozen rivers that cracked beneath their feet, walked through valleys where wind cut the skin like knives. Every step was a prayer whispered to an unseen future. Archaeologists have traced their paths in footprints fossilized in mud, in tools left buried where glaciers once stood. These travelers did not know they were changing the course of human history. They only knew the cold behind them and the faint promise of warmth ahead. But their movement reshaped continents. They followed the retreating sun into Asia, into the Middle East, into lands where the air softened and food returned. Some moved through corridors of ice, narrow valleys carved between glaciers, where wind roared like an animal. Others followed coastlines, fishing through holes in frozen sea. There were no maps, no directions, only instinct, memory, and the pull of survival. The earth itself was both enemy and guide. And yet, amid the hardship, there was awe. They saw landscapes no human eyes had ever seen. Mountains of blue ice glowing in the moonlight, valleys filled with clouds of frozen breath, rivers sparkling under northern stars. To walk through that silence was to feel small and infinite at once. The cold did not just threaten them, it revealed the vastness of the world. In this way, the Ice Age became the first great teacher of movement. It stripped humanity of comfort, forcing adaptation not just of body, but of imagination. New tools emerged, bone-tipped spears, fur-lined boots, shelters half dug into the earth. They learned to read the wind, to follow the migration of herds, to predict the shift of the sky. The journey became not punishment, but transformation. The cold had no mercy, yet it demanded cooperation. No one survived alone. Tribes that once competed learned to share fire, to exchange tools and stories. Around campfires in the snow, they traded not wealth, but wisdom. Which paths were safe, which stars marked south, which plants could still be eaten beneath the frost. The cold forced unity, and unity became civilization. In every direction, humanity scattered, some reaching the frozen shores of Siberia, others crossing ice bridges that once connected continents. The Bering Land Bridge, stretching between Asia and the Americas, became a gateway to new worlds. Entire generations were born and buried along that path, their footprints fading into the snow. They didn't know they were writing the story of human expansion. They only knew that standing still meant death. And so, they moved endlessly, restlessly carrying with them fire, faith, and memory. The children of those journeys grew up knowing motion as home. To them, the sound of crunching ice was comfort, the horizon a promise. They learned to read the language of wind and distance. Each journey became inheritance, passed from parent to child not through words, but through footsteps. When the ice finally began to melt, the world they entered was unrecognizable. Rivers burst free, forests returned, and grasslands stretched wide where glaciers had once ruled. Humanity had been remade. The cold that once drove them nearly to extinction had forged resilience into their bones. They had learned that life is not found by resisting change, but by moving with it. And though millennia have passed, that ancient instinct still whispers within us, the pull to move when comfort turns to danger, to seek warmth beyond the edge of the known. The cold once forced our ancestors to leave everything behind. But in doing so, it taught them something sacred, that survival is not about staying, it is about becoming. They walked into the unknown not as victims of the cold, but as its apprentices. And in every migration that followed every voyage, every discovery, every leap into the dark, that same ancient rhythm echoed. The sound of footsteps crunching over ice, the heartbeat of a species refusing to stand still. Before compasses, before maps, only courage and cold. Long before the age of written history, there were explorers whose names the wind erased. They left no monuments, no scrolls, no record, but the faint trace of fire on stone and the ghost of a path across the snow. Yet they were the first to cross the boundaries of the known world, the original navigators of the white wilderness. They walked where the sky touched the ice, following nothing but instinct and memory. Their journeys began not in glory, but necessity. The cold had tightened its hold on the world, and survival demanded movement. Still, there were always a few who went farther than the rest. Those drawn not by fear, but by a strange curiosity, a pull toward the unknown. Archaeologists have found their remains in the most desolate of places. A frozen body high in the Alps, wrapped in grass and hide, an arrow still lodged in his back. They call him Ötzi now, but in life he was one of many. His story is silent, but the artifacts around him speak. Tools carved with precision, a copper blade carried like treasure, herbs tucked carefully into a pouch. He was not a wanderer by mistake, he was a traveller by design, a man whose footsteps stitched together valleys and tribes. In the frozen plateaus of Siberia, explorers have unearthed entire camps beneath layers of permafrost hearths, tools, bones, and the faint impressions of woven mats. They tell of people who moved across the tundra with purpose, who mapped the world not in ink, but in experience. Their compasses were the stars, their guides the flight of birds and the paths of animals. The ice was not just obstacle, it was archive. It preserved what it took, keeping bodies and memories intact across millennia. Each discovery is a whisper from those forgotten travellers. The pattern of wear on a spearhead, the soot on a stone, the shape of a footprint frozen in mud. Together, they form a kind of unwritten scripture, the gospel of endurance. We often imagine exploration as something born in the modern age, but the truth is older. Long before ships and sextants, there were journeys of equal magnitude migrations that spanned continents, crossings that defied comprehension. A single family following a herd across the tundra was as daring as any ocean voyage. Each step was an act of faith, each night a confrontation with the limits of life itself. And yet, those travellers left behind more than artifacts. They left memory. Their roots became the first invisible maps passed down through stories, songs, and symbols carved into bone. A line of mountains remembered as sleeping gods, a river named for the shape it made when it froze, a constellation that pointed home. These were the coordinates of the ancient world, written not in letters, but in myth. Some of those myths still linger. Across northern cultures, tales speak of travellers who vanished into the snow and returned, changed wiser, quieter, touched by something beyond the human. The Sami told of wanderers who found the white edge, where the land meets the endless light. The Nenets spoke of men who walked so far north they stepped into the sky. Every story hints at the same truth. Exploration was never just physical. It was spiritual, a pilgrimage into the unknown, an initiation through suffering and wonder. Even now, we remember these forgotten explorers not by name, but by feeling that same pull toward distant horizons, the same yearning to see what lies beyond the last hill. It is an inheritance carried in our blood, the echo of a species that once walked across frozen oceans. The human drive to explore is not a modern impulse, it is the oldest instinct we have. The ice has hidden their faces, but not their courage. Somewhere beneath the glaciers lie the bones of the first dreamers, those who refused to turn back when the cold closed in. They looked into the white and saw not death, but possibility. And though we can no longer hear their voices, every time we step into the unknown, every expedition, every invention, every quiet act of discovery, we answer their call. The first explorers did not conquer the world. They simply kept walking until it changed. They didn't write history. They sang it into time. When the journeys ended, when the ice had retreated, and the world began to breathe again, what remained was memory. But memory, in those early days, was not written in stone or ink. It lived in rhythm and story, in voices rising around fires, in lullabies that disguised survival lessons. The story of how humanity endured the cold became the story of who we were. Each tribe carried its version of the beginning, a tale of exile and return, of ancestors who walked through endless night to find the dawn. In Siberia, they said their people were born from the snow itself, that the first breath of life came when the frost melted on the lips of the gods. Among the Sami, stories told of families who followed the reindeer south until the stars shifted, and there they found the first sunrise. In the far north of America, elders spoke of ice bridges that once stretched between worlds now long gone, but remembered as pathways of the brave. These stories were not told for entertainment. They were maps, songs of survival disguised as legend. Each detail, each verse, contained knowledge: where to find shelter, which rivers froze last, which plants still grew beneath the snow. The rhythm of the song made memory durable, the melody carrying wisdom across generations. Long before writing, people encoded their history in sound. A single migration could last centuries. Entire lifetimes would pass before a tribe reached its new home. To keep continuity, they told and retold their beginnings until the story itself became sacred. To forget one's origin was to risk losing the thread of identity. In this way, storytelling became not just culture, but survival. The spoken word was a bridge between ancestors and descendants, between the frozen past and the living present. Archaeologists studying ancient oral cultures have found that such tales often preserve astonishingly accurate memories of real events. Stories from Aboriginal Australians recall coastlines that vanished beneath the sea, changes that happened over 7,000 years ago. Myths from the Arctic speak of ice sheets advancing and withdrawing, describing with uncanny precision the end of the last glacial period. Memory, it seems, could last longer than stone. The elders who carried these tales were the true historians of the ancient world. Around them, children would gather, listening to voices that had gathered dust and fire in equal measure. Each pause in the story held weight. Each silence was part of the rhythm. They learned not just what to remember, but how to remember through sound, through repetition, through reverence. As generations passed, the migrations turned from necessity into legend. The paths once walked became sacred routes. Mountains climbed for survival became holy peaks. Rivers crossed for escape became borders between worlds. Over time, the practical merged with the spiritual history, dissolving into myth. But within the myth, truth endured. Even now, fragments of those ancient migrations survive in the way people speak, sing, and dream. Folk songs echo the cadence of travel, the steady rhythm of feet over snow. Words for home, in many languages, still carry the trace of movement, not a fixed place, but a returning, a coming back. We think of migration as motion through space, but to our ancestors, it was motion through meaning. To move was to remember. There is a quiet beauty in that the idea that memory is not static but alive. Like the travelers who carried it, memory moves. It adapts, transforms, and endures. It survives every extinction of language, every fall of civilization. It finds new voices to speak through. When the storytellers of the old world sang their migration songs, they weren't just recalling the past, they were ensuring the future. Each word was a safeguard against forgetting. Each verse was a reminder that survival had always depended on remembering what the earth once demanded of us. And perhaps that is why these stories still resonate. Somewhere in our collective mind, the frost still lingers. The echo of those migrations still hums beneath the noise of modern life. We may not walk across ice anymore, but we still carry the same need to belong, to journey, to tell the story of how we made it through the dark. Because even when the ice melted, the memory of the cold remained. And in that memory, we remember ourselves. Every sunrise was a miracle they refused to take for granted. In the heart of the ancient winter, when dawn vanished for weeks or months, humanity learned to worship light itself. The sun was not just a star, it was breath, memory, promise. Its disappearance each year was not a predictable event, but a cosmic death. And when it returned, even faintly, it was resurrection. From the frozen plains of the north to the sands of Egypt, the same story unfolded under different names. The people of the Nile watched the horizon with trembling hope, believing the god Ra sailed each night through an underworld of darkness. Every dawn, when light spilled again over the desert, they saw proof that even death could be overcome. In temples aligned with the solstice sun, they built doorways of stone that caught the first ray of morning, not for spectacle, but gratitude. Far to the north, where the darkness lingered longer, the Norse told of Balder, the radiant god whose death brought on the world's winter. His eventual return signaled the renewal of all things, a divine echo of the sun's rebirth. To them, light was not permanent. It was something fought for, mourned, and celebrated. They sang of it through the long night, so it would find its way back. Among the Slavs, the sun was Dazbog, the giver of warmth, life, and justice. When winter came, they said the sun god grew old and weak, chased across the sky by wolves of ice. At midwinter, people lit fires on hilltops to strengthen him, their flames mirroring the great light they hoped to restore. The act was more than ritual. It was empathy in motion. They were helping the universe survive its own darkness. Everywhere, the pattern was the same: the dying sun, the descent into shadow, the triumphant return. Whether carved in stone, painted on cave walls, or whispered beside the fire, these myths spoke of the same truth. Light's fragility made it sacred. When you live in a world where the sun disappears, belief becomes a bridge between despair and dawn. These stories were not superstition. They were survival psychology wrapped in poetry. To believe that light would return gave reason to endure. To imagine that a god fought for dawn was to believe that life itself wanted to continue. Myth was not escapism, it was endurance made visible. Even today, we echo those ancient instincts without knowing it. We still gather at the end of the year, lighting candles, stringing lights, celebrating renewal in the heart of darkness. The names have changed: Yule, Christmas, Sol Invictus, but the emotion remains the same. We celebrate because deep down, we remember what it felt like to doubt that morning would come. To the ancients, the winter solstice was the hinge of existence, the longest night before rebirth. They did not mark it on calendars. They felt it in their bones. The fires they lit were more than heat. They were symbols of defiance, declarations that hope was stronger than the dark. Across continents and centuries, the same flame burned. In Rome, in Siberia, in forgotten valleys where people stood in silence to watch the faintest streak of light crawl over the horizon. What we call mythology was, for them, a mirror. The sun's journey was their own descent into hardship, endurance through shadow, return to warmth. Every dawn reflected humanity's endless cycle of loss and renewal. The people saw themselves in the heavens, small, fragile, yet capable of surviving even the death of the light. And so, when the first rays returned after the long night, they didn't simply watch, they wept. The light touched their faces like forgiveness. Smoke rose from the fires, curling into the pale sky, carrying prayers that sounded the same in every language: gratitude, relief, awe. For another year, they had been spared. For another season, the world would live. The myth of the sun's death and rebirth wasn't about gods alone. It was about remembering that endings were never absolute. It taught that what seems gone may only be sleeping, waiting to return. In that lesson lies something eternal. That hope, too, follows its own orbit. When the ancient storytellers spoke of Ra rising again, of Baldur reborn, of Dazbog outpacing the wolves of ice, they were really speaking of us, of the part of the human spirit that refuses to stay buried in darkness. Because every sunrise, then and now, is a resurrection. And every winter night carries the memory of light. When hunger took shape, it had fangs. In the depths of winter, when firewood ran low and food stores thinned, imagination became both shield and warning. The nights grew so long that even sound seemed afraid to travel, and in that silence, the mind began to build its own companions. The beasts of the long night were not born from fantasy. They were carved from hunger, fear, and the fragile morality that cold can strip away. Among the Algonquin peoples of North America, the Wendigo haunted the forests, a spirit of insatiable hunger, part man and part ice. It was said to begin as a person who, starving in winter, had eaten human flesh. The act transformed them, freezing the soul while stretching the body into something monstrous. The Wendigo's heart was said to be made of ice, and no matter how much it consumed, it was never full. It was not just a tale of terror, it was a warning, that in starvation, one must not lose their humanity. The story reminded every listener that the worst hunger was not of the stomach, but of the spirit. Across the mountains of Europe, in dark forests where snow hung from the branches like teeth, other creatures stirred. The Krampus, horned and shaggy, stalked the villages of the Alps. Where winter brought famine, Krampus punished greed, dragging those who hoarded or lied into the night with chains of frost. His presence shadowed the generosity of St. Nicholas, balancing kindness with consequence. Together, they formed a moral equilibrium, light and darkness walking side by side through the snow. In the Slavic world, it was Baba Yaga, the witch, who lived in a house that walked on chicken legs, who devoured those foolish enough to wander alone into the cold woods. To children, she was terror. To adults, wisdom in disguise. She represented nature itself, unpredictable, merciless, yet ultimately fair. Those who respected her rules survived. Those who defied them became her meal. The story taught that survival depended on respect not only for elders and strangers, but for the wild itself. These winter monsters shared a common purpose. They were teachers dressed as nightmares, embodiments of nature's hard truths. Each warned against the same vices: greed, isolation, disobedience, waste. When the cold could kill without malice, humanity needed to invent something with malice, something that would keep them moral when survival tempted cruelty. Even in the far north, the Inuit told of Iraklujwak, the giant who hunted those who broke taboos, who failed to share, or who wasted food. His approach was heralded by a deep rumbling, like the cracking of ice. To avoid his wrath, families offered portions of their meal to the spirits of the land and sea. Through myth, generosity became law. These creatures reflected the fragile balance of life in winter, the line between survival and sin, between endurance and madness. When the world outside seemed empty, these stories filled it with invisible consequence, reminding people that even in the coldest silence, they were being watched. Fear, in that sense, was functional. It kept fires burning, kept communities united. A shared monster was a shared conscience. Around each hearth, the tales were retold, soft at first, then sharper, the moral thread woven carefully through the chill of suspense. Children listened, wide-eyed, the lessons slipping quietly beneath their skin. To survive, one must remain human, even when the world forgets warmth. It's easy now to think of these monsters as fantasy, but to the people who birthed them, they were reality given shape. The cold did not simply freeze bodies, it sculpted culture. The darkness was not empty. It was populated by memory, morality, and imagination. And though the Wendigo, the Krampus, and Baba Yaga may have faded into folklore, their message still lingers. We still create monsters to explain hunger, greed, and the danger of forgetting others in pursuit of self. Our modern demons have new names: addiction, ambition, apathy. But they serve the same purpose: to remind us where the line lies between survival and surrender. The beasts of the long night are mirrors, not myths. They stare back at us from the edge of the firelight, asking the same ancient question: when the world turns cold, what part of you will you keep warm? If warmth made us dreamers, the cold made us human. Long before civilization, before cities or stories, the cold shaped what we became. It carved not only landscapes but minds, sculpting patience, empathy, and foresight out of necessity. In the heart of winter, survival was never a solitary act. It required imagination and cooperation. Fire may have been our first invention, but community was our first miracle. The Ice Ages were not kind. They demanded everything: strength, endurance, creativity. But in that relentless testing, something profound emerged. Families huddled together not only for warmth, but for comfort. Around the fire, the first lullabies were sung, the first myths told. Language itself may have deepened in the dark, born from the need to coordinate, to reassure, to hope. The cold stripped away excess and left behind only what was essential: connection. Anthropologists believe that many of the traits that define us, empathy, planning, symbolic thought, were sharpened during those long winters. When food was scarce, cooperation mattered more than competition. When darkness endured, imagination became a tool of survival. To foresee, to plan, to dream, these were not luxuries, they were lifelines. The brain rewired itself to think ahead, to care beyond the moment. The cold taught us time. Even our bodies bear its memory. The layers of fat that protect us, the instinct to gather, the shiver that ignites warmth in our muscles. These are echoes of the ancient lesson that life persists through adaptation. The human body became a vessel of resilience, shaped by every frost that once threatened to erase it. But perhaps the greatest transformation was invisible. The cold made us philosophical. It forced us to face the void, the silence, the stillness, the endless dark, and ask what we were doing here. When warmth faded, meaning had to take its place. The stars became our companions, the fire our altar. In that contrast between what could be lost and what could be imagined, consciousness deepened. From this crucible of ice, art was born. The cave paintings of Lascaux, the carved figurines of mammoth bone, the delicate flutes of ancient hunters, all traces of a mind refusing to surrender to the dark. Creation was defiance. To make beauty in the midst of cold was to prove that warmth could exist within. Even empathy, our ability to feel another's suffering, may have been sharpened by winter. When survival depended on shared fire, compassion became instinct. The weak were not abandoned. They were protected. For tomorrow the strong might falter too. The cold taught us not only endurance, but mercy. We often imagine evolution as a ladder of progress, but it is also a dialogue between the world's indifference and the human will to make meaning. The cold asked a question, and humanity answered with invention, emotion, and story. It was a conversation written across millennia, a trial that refined rather than destroyed us. And even now, though most of us no longer face the old winters, their shadow remains. We still build fires, though they flicker on screens. We still gather in circles, still tell stories when the world feels dark. Every act of creativity, every gesture of kindness, every attempt to understand the unknown, these are echoes of the same instinct that once kept us alive beneath frozen stars. The cold, in its way, gave us depth. It taught us that warmth is not merely a temperature, but a choice, a state of mind we must keep alive, even when the sun disappears. It showed us that fragility can give birth to strength, that endurance can coexist with tenderness. So when we look back across the vast timeline of our species, through the glaciers and migrations and myths, we see not just survival, we see transformation. The cold could have extinguished us, but instead, it revealed us. It made us curious, compassionate, creative. It made us human. And perhaps that is the truest legacy of winter, that in the face of emptiness, we learned to fill it with meaning. The world froze, and we began to dream. We've outlived the Ice Age, but not the memory of it. Somewhere deep within us, the frost still lingers, a quiet inheritance written not in words, but in instinct. We no longer face the endless night or the silence of frozen plains, yet we still behave as if the cold might return. We still hoard, we still gather, we still fear the dark. The ancient winters may have ended, but their echoes live in our bones. When storms roll in or the power flickers out, notice how quickly we reach for warmth. A blanket, a light, a human voice. The gesture is almost automatic, older than reason. It is the same motion our ancestors made when they pressed closer around the fire, when they shared food, when they whispered stories to keep the dark from swallowing their minds. We call it comfort now. They called it survival. Even our homes, these sealed glowing boxes, are echoes of ancient shelters. The hum of central heating is the sound of perpetual fire. The soft orange light of a lamp mimics the colour of flame. And when night falls, we fill our spaces with small lights, candles, screens, street lamps, as if refusing to admit that the sun has truly gone. The modern world may be wired and bright, but our psychology still lives by firelight. The cold shaped more than our behaviour, it shaped our emotions. Why does silence make us uneasy? Why does loneliness bite like frost? Because once, isolation was death. The human mind learned to equate warmth with company, safety with proximity. We seek others not just for affection, but for survival. Every friendship, every family, every city is a distant reflection of those early winter circles, the firelight flickering across familiar faces, the comfort of shared breath in the dark. Even our celebrations echo those ancient solstice rituals. Every December, in every corner of the world, we gather to mark the return of light. We light candles, share food, exchange gifts, all acts of defiance against the cold. The names of the festivals have changed, but the feeling remains the same: gratitude that the darkness did not win. Each song, each flame, each story told beside a tree or table is a quiet inheritance from the age when light was life itself. Science has changed the world, but not the body's memory. On winter nights, when the air grows still and the world seems to pause, something inside us stirs an old awareness, half fear, half wonder. We sense the fragility of existence, the way it once hung on a single spark, a shared meal, a moment of trust. Beneath our comfort and technology, we still carry that memory like a scar that never fully fades. And perhaps that is why we still crave stories of survival. We are drawn to them not only for adventure, but recognition. The ancient struggle against the cold reminds us of what we still face in quieter forms. Loneliness, uncertainty, the invisible winters of the soul. The fire we seek now is emotional. Connection, meaning, hope. We survive modern winters not with furs and embers, but with compassion and memory. In our language too, the echoes remain. We speak of warmth as kindness, of coldness as cruelty. We say a person thawed when they began to open their heart. The metaphors are ancient, inherited directly from those who lived by the fire's glow. Even love, the warmth we feel in another's presence, is a remnant of that same survival instinct. We were shaped to find warmth beautiful because warmth meant life. Yet the memory of winter serves a purpose. It reminds us to be humble. It whispers that comfort is borrowed, not guaranteed that what we have now exists because others once endured what we could not. Every electric light, every heated room, every full table is built on the courage of those who refuse to let the cold have the last word. And so, even now, we keep making small fires. We cook for each other. We tell stories. We turn to the glow of screens, not just for distraction, but for a sense of company, a modern echo of the ancient circle. Deep down, we are still that same species of firekeepers, haunted by the memory of cold and comforted by the light we create. We may have conquered the elements, but the ancient lesson remains. Survival is never just about the body. It is about the warmth we share. The Ice Age ended tens of thousands of years ago, but in our instincts, it never truly melted. Because every time the night feels too long, we still do what they did. We gather, we listen, and we wait for the sun to return. They still keep the same fires burning, not for heat, but remembrance. Across the Arctic, in the mountains of Siberia, and deep within the tundra, there are people whose lives remain threaded to the rhythm of ice and flame. While much of the world has forgotten what survival once meant, they continue to live in quiet dialogue with the cold-carrying wisdom that has outlasted empires, borders, and time itself. Among the Inuit of the far north, the hearth remains sacred. Generations still light the quiliku, an ancient oil lamp carved from stone, filled with seal fat and lit by moss. Its soft flame once warmed tents made of snow and skin, and today it glows in ceremonial gatherings. To them, the quilikwa is not just fire, it is memory made visible. Each flicker recalls ancestors who learned to live where no sun rose for months, who found balance between harshness and gratitude. In the frozen expanses of Siberia, the Nenets still guide their reindeer herds across endless white horizons. Their canvas tents, called chums, rise like small embers against the snow, each one a living echo of prehistoric design, portable, circular, centered around the hearth. Within these spaces, warmth and community are indistinguishable. Meals are shared, stories passed down, songs sung in the same cadence as the wind outside. Every gesture is a conversation with the past. Farther west, the Sami people of northern Scandinavia still move with the seasons. Their ancestors once tracked herds by starlight and kept calendars in the sky. Though snowmobiles have replaced sleds and modern fabrics have replaced furs, the principle remains unchanged: to live with the land, not against it. Fire still marks the center of every camp, a small circle of heat, surrounded by laughter, smoke, and the hum of the Arctic. These cultures preserve something the modern world often forgets: that warmth is sacred because it is fragile. Their survival is not built on conquest, but conversation with the ice, the wind, and the silence. Science now studies what they have always known instinctively: that adaptation is not domination, it is harmony. The reindeer herder, the fisherman, the hunter each learns from the cold rather than fighting it. In a laboratory, adaptation is a theory. In the Arctic, it is a heartbeat. Anthropologists who visit these communities speak of the serenity that lingers, even in hardship. The cold no longer frightens them, it teaches them. Rituals of warmth, lighting a lamp, sharing food, singing into the dark, become daily affirmations of resilience. These acts are small, but they hold entire histories. Every flame lit today carries the DNA of fires kindled 30,000 years ago. Modern science confirms what tradition has always understood, that survival depends as much on spirit as on shelter. The flame that once kept ancient hunters alive now burns in the form of memory, knowledge, and culture. Each generation that passes on a story or skill keeps the lineage of endurance unbroken. In many Arctic villages, schools now teach children both mathematics and myth, the equations of survival and the poetry of it. They learn how to read snowdrifts, how to listen to the wind, how to predict weather from the color of the horizon. These lessons bridge the old and the new, showing that ancestral wisdom is not primitive, it is precise. And perhaps that is what the rest of the world is beginning to rediscover. As climates shift again and winters grow unpredictable, humanity looks once more to those who never stopped listening to the earth. In the flicker of a seal oil flame, in the song of a herder calling to his reindeer, we find the quiet truth of our species. The cold was never the enemy, forgetting was. So they keep their fires burning, not just to survive, but to remember. Each flame says the same thing in every language that life endures, that gratitude is stronger than fear, and that we owe our warmth to those who once had none. In these remote corners of the world, where ice still breathes and silence still rules, the past is not lost. It is alive, glowing faintly in every hearth, the same fire that once saved us, now preserved by the few who still understand its meaning. And in that light, ancient and trembling, humanity sees itself again. The sun always returns, but only because someone kept the fire alive. It begins as a whisper of light, a faint shimmer on the horizon, more feeling than sight. After months of darkness, people once gathered to watch for that glow breath held, hearts trembling, faces turned toward the edge of the world. It was not just dawn they awaited, it was proof that life would continue. The first sunrise after the long night was more than a moment, it was resurrection. In the Arctic, they say the world sighs when the light comes back. The snow softens, the air changes, and even the wind seems to sing. Ancient families stepped outside their huts or tents, blinking in disbelief. Some wept openly, their tears freezing before they could fall. Others sang softly songs older than memory, offered to the sky as thanks. For a people who had lived by the rhythm of darkness, the return of light was nothing short of divine. That ancient awe still lingers within us. Even now, in the electric glow of our cities, we feel it, that subtle lift when the days grow longer, when spring sunlight spills through windows we forgot could be so bright. We may not call it worship anymore, but our hearts remember. We clean our homes, open curtains, breathe deeper. The sun's return still feels like forgiveness. In a way, every dawn is a small reenactment of that miracle. We rise from our own darkness, the long nights of doubt, the winters of the soul, and step once more into light. The fire within us, kindled by those who came before, still burns. Every generation carries it forward, sometimes dim, sometimes fierce, but never extinguished. It is what connects us to those first watchers of the sun, a chain of endurance unbroken by time. When we look at the past, it's easy to see only struggle, the ice, the hunger, the endless cold. But beneath that suffering was something astonishing: faith. They believed, without proof, that warmth would return. They stored food for a season that might never come, built homes that might collapse under snow, sang songs to a sky that gave no answer, and yet they continued. That persistence, that quiet refusal to surrender, is the true fire within us. Modern life hides it well. Our fires are invisible now, glowing inside circuits, humming behind screens. But the instinct is unchanged. We still gather around sources of light. We still seek warmth in one another's presence. When the world feels cold, when loneliness, loss, or fear press in, we do what they did. We light something, even if it's small. A candle, a conversation, a hope. The story of humanity has always been a cycle of freezing and thawing, losing and finding, darkness and dawn. The Ice Age ended, but the pattern remained within history, within us. Each generation faces its own winters, and each must learn again how to endure. The lesson our ancestors left is simple, but eternal. Do not wait for warmth to come from the sky. Create it where you stand. Because the sun's return is never guaranteed. It is earned through patience, through faith, through the fragile courage of keeping a single flame alive in endless night. Imagine them now, those first witnesses of light, the hunters, the herders, the mothers, the children, standing on a ridge of ice, faces upturned, eyes wide with wonder as the world blushes gold again. They would not have known the word hope. They didn't need it. They had fire and each other, and that was enough. Their breath became clouds that drifted into the future, into us. And every time we find beauty after hardship, every time we choose kindness over despair, we repeat their oldest ritual, the welcoming of light. So, as this story ends, picture the horizon brightening, the snow glittering, the frost melting, the silence breaking into birdsong, the fire inside each of us small, steady, sacred, flickering in rhythm with the Sunday. Because this is the truth they left us. The cold will always come, but so will the dawn. And if we remember how to keep the fire alive, the sun will always return. And so, the long night ends. From the first spark struck against stone to the glow of modern cities, our story has always been one of light, fragile, defiant, eternal. Every flicker of fire, every heartbeat in the dark, every whispered tale beside the flames was an act of faith. We were never just surviving winter. We were learning how to be human. The ancients built their courage from frost and silence. They found beauty in endurance, meaning in the cold. And even now, though our winters no longer threaten our lives, they still visit our hearts. The world grows dark, and once again we must remember what they knew, that warmth is something made, not found. So tonight, as you drift into sleep, imagine their fires still burning in caves, in tents, beneath northern skies. Imagine their breath rising into dawn. We are the continuation of that glow, the living memory of every soul who kept the flame alive when the sun had vanished. The cold will come again. It always does. But so will the light. And between them always lives the fire within us.